On a morning in the year 1602, the most consequential piece of paper in human financial history was about to be printed. It was not a proclamation from a monarch, nor a religious text, nor a map that promised hidden gold. It was a certificate of ownership, a share, as they would call it, in a merchant company. And with that single document, ordinary people, people with little education or claim to power, would suddenly be able to own pieces of a distant empire. They would be able to trade their ownership away. They would be able to watch its value rise and fall like the tide. The world had never seen anything like it. But let us begin not with the paper itself, but with the harbour where this idea was born, where the first trembling lights of commerce and mathematics began to coalesce into something that would reshape continents. Amsterdam's harbour, on the morning when the United East India Company received its charter, was wrapped in mist. The kind of mist that rolls in from the North Sea, thick and cold, that muffles sound and transforms the world into a place of fragmented forms and suggestion. The wooden ships, hundreds of them, were little more than dark silhouettes against the grey, their hulls creaking in the gentle swell, ropes groaning as they strained against their moorings. Somewhere in that mist, a bell rang, thin and distant. Seabirds called out, their voices flattened by the moisture in the air. The smell was unmistakable. Salt, tar, rotting wood, the centuries-old perfume of a working harbour where human ambition collided with the sea. The water lapped softly against the docks. Somewhere, a sailor was singing, a low, weary kind of song, the type men sing when they've been awake too long. Footsteps echoed on the wet stone. A cart creaked past, its iron wheels making a sound like a complaint. These were the ordinary sounds of a harbour town stirring before dawn, the ambient noise of men preparing ships for impossibly long voyages, gathering ropes and barrels and supplies, checking calculations on pieces of parchment, trying to account for the vast expense of it all. If you have ever wondered how the world's financial systems really began, not in theory, not in the minds of modern economists, but in the lived, sensory reality of human beings trying to solve impossible problems, if you want to understand how your own relationship with ownership, risk, and wealth was shaped by decisions made 4 centuries ago in a cold harbour town, I invite you to follow along with me as we trace the hidden origins of the global stock market through the story of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. Subscribe now, and we will walk together through these slow, surprising chapters of how ordinary merchants invented the machinery that would allow human beings to own the world. The mist in Amsterdam that morning was beginning to lift. Just barely, a lighter grey showed through here and there, like fabric being slowly drawn back from a lamp. The horizon was still invisible, still folded away in cloud and vapour, but somewhere beyond that mist, beyond those ships and those docks, lay the Indies, Java, the Moluccas, islands so remote and fabled that they existed in European minds almost as myth. These were the places where spices grew: nutmeg, cloves, mace, pepper, cinnamon. The scent alone could be worth more than a ship. For nearly a century, the Portuguese had monopolized the routes to these lands. They had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, established forts and trading posts, used violence and cunning to keep other nations at bay. But the Portuguese, for all their bravery and navigation, were stretched thin. Their empire was vast and fragmented. Their ships were vulnerable. And the Dutch were watching. They were waiting. They were calculating. The harbour noise continued. A shout here, the splash of a rope being thrown there, the grind of a winch hauling cargo. The mist was definitely lifting now. You could make out details of the ships with more clarity. The intricate rigging, the curve of the hulls, the weathered wood that had survived Atlantic storms and Indian Ocean swells. Each of these vessels represented an enormous expense. Each voyage meant risk, the risk of pirates, of storms, of disease, of navigational error so grave that a ship simply vanished into the great expanse of ocean and was never heard from again. And yet, despite these risks, despite the weight of these dangers, merchants kept building ships. They kept sending them forth. They kept borrowing money they barely had. Why? Because the potential profit was so vast, so astronomical, that even the fear of total loss could not overcome the hunger to reach the Indies. But here is where something remarkable was beginning to happen. There in Amsterdam, in that cold harbour, as the mist continued its slow retreat. The problem was not how to send one ship. Merchants had been doing that for centuries. The problem was how to send many ships, repeatedly, in an organized way that could outlast any single merchant's lifetime or fortune. The problem was how to pool the resources of dozens, of hundreds of people, and trust them enough to invest money they might never see again. The answer would come from paper, from mathematics, from a kind of radical trust in abstract value. The sun, though still hidden beyond the horizon line, was beginning to brighten the mist from within, as if the grey were a veil being illuminated from behind. The harbour would soon be fully awake. Men would arrive with tools and ledgers, decisions would be made, ships would be loaded. But for a few moments longer, there was still this quietness, this sense of possibility, the moment before a transformation began. In this mist, on this harbour, was born an idea that would change everything. Not conquest, not exploration, not spice. An idea about ownership itself, about how many people could hold a piece of one thing together, about how that piece could have a price, about how that price could change every single day based on what people believed the future would bring. It is an idea that still defines our world, though most of us do not think about its origins or pause to consider that it was not inevitable, that it could have been invented differently, that it nearly was not invented at all. The harbour was waking now. The mist was finally rising, lifting like a curtain drawn upward, revealing the full landscape of commercial anxiety and hope that lay beneath. And across Amsterdam, in homes and counting houses, merchants were beginning to move toward their desks, their ledgers, their calculations. They did not yet know that history was arriving, but it was. It was already here. The mist rises from the Amstel River in those earliest hours before the city stirs. The wooden pilings creak beneath the weight of vessels that have returned from months at sea, their hulls heavy with cargo that represents fortunes and the dreams of people who will never sail themselves. In these quiet moments, before the merchants arrive at the docks with their ledgers and their calculations, there exists a kind of threshold between the old world of trade and something entirely new, something that would, within a generation, reshape how human beings think about ownership, risk, and the very possibility of wealth itself. The story you are listening to now, the slow unfolding of how a single Dutch trading company became the crucible in which modern finance was born, is one thread in a much larger tapestry. There are other histories waiting in the shadows, the origins of insurance, the quiet mechanics of how credit systems first learned to scale across oceans, the peculiar psychology that makes ordinary people believe they can become wealthy by owning a fraction of a venture they will never see. These are the hidden origins of the global financial world that surrounds us still, the architectural blueprints that were laid down in candlelit counting houses and on the floor of a bustling exchange, sketched by people who were simply trying to solve a problem of their own time. If you find yourself drawn to these slow journeys through the forgotten machinery of how the world actually works, the kind of deep historical explorations that reveal not just what happened, but why it continues to echo through centuries, then consider following along. There are many more of these narratives waiting, each one designed to meet you in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, where information settles into memory, not through force, but through the gentle persistence of a voice and a story, that refuses to rush. The world of global finance can seem distant and impersonal when you encounter it only through the abstractions of news cycles and market reports. But when you trace it back to its source, when you listen to the creak of the ships and smell the salt air, and understand that the mechanics of shareholder capitalism were invented by real people responding to genuine problems, something shifts. The abstract becomes human, the impossible becomes merely difficult, and the origins of our present moment reveal themselves as something we might actually understand, given time and attention, and the willingness to sit with a story as it unfolds. What draws us to the origins of things? Perhaps it is the quiet recognition that understanding how something began can illuminate why it persists, why we still speak of dividends and shares, why the idea of owning a piece of something distant and uncertain still excites us, why the concept of a joint stock company still seems, in some essential way, revolutionary. The VOC was not the first trading company, but it was the first to solve a fundamental problem. How do you raise enough capital to mount a voyage that will take months and cost a small fortune, when no single merchant has enough gold to bear that risk alone? The answer to that question would reshape the world. In the pages and passages that follow through the hours ahead, we will move slowly through the circumstances that made this innovation possible. We will linger in the late 16th century, when Europe was hungry for spices and Portuguese traders held an iron grip on the supply. We will watch as rival Dutch merchants began their own ventures, pouring resources into competing expeditions that bled away profits and divided power among too many hands. And then we will witness the moment of consolidation, the Charter of 1602 that brought unity from chaos, and with it, a structure so elegant and so powerful that it became the template for nearly every large commercial undertaking that followed. But before we descend into that history, into the figures and dates and the slow accumulation of detail that makes a story true, it is worth pausing here in the mist, in this threshold moment, to acknowledge what you are about to encounter. These are not abstract lessons in economics. These are stories about human beings, their ambitions, their calculations, their hopes for security, and their willingness to bet against terrible odds. They are stories about how necessity breeds innovation, and how an idea, once born, takes on a life of its own and begins to reshape the world in ways that its creators could never have fully anticipated. The harbour is still quiet. The fog has not yet burned away. But somewhere in that mist, the lights are beginning to kindle in the counting houses. The merchants are arriving with their documents. The money is beginning to move, in amounts both large and small, from the hands of those who have it, into ventures that will carry it across oceans, toward profit and loss, toward triumph and catastrophe, toward the uncertain future that awaits on distant shores. And it is in this moment, in this precise configuration of ambition and need and clever thinking, that the stock market will be born, not as an abstraction, but as a solution to a very real problem, invented by people whose names we will come to know, whose decisions will ripple forward across centuries. The story continues just beyond this threshold, in the hours that follow. For now, though, let the sound of the water and the creak of the pilings and the distant call of a bird moving through the mist be enough. Picture, if you will, a kitchen in the year 1585. A merchant's wife in Antwerp is preparing dinner for her household, and somewhere on her table sits a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in cloth the colour of old parchment, are a few precious grains of nutmeg. Not because her family is particularly wealthy, though they are comfortable enough, but because nutmeg, in that moment, in that corner of Europe, costs as much as a house might cost today. A single pound of cloves could feed a labourer's family for months. And pepper, common black pepper, the spice that seasons the simplest broth, was literally worth its weight in silver. This hunger for spices was not mere culinary desire, you understand. It ran deeper into the fabric of European life. These distant flavors from the Moluccas, from Java, from the Spice Islands whose names themselves seemed to shimmer with mystery, were not luxuries in the modern sense. They were, in a very real way, the technology of preservation, the only reliable means by which meat could be stored through winter without spoiling, by which food could be masked when it began to turn, by which the long dark months could be made more bearable by the warmth of flavor. And there was something else too, an almost mystical belief in the medicinal properties of these powders and seeds. Nutmeg could aid digestion, warm the blood, calm the mind. Cloves could ease toothache and fever. Mace could sharpen memory. Whether these remedies truly worked matters less than the fact that Europeans believed they did, and that belief created an insatiable, almost desperate need. Yet here was the problem, and it shaped the destiny of nations. Every single one of these treasures had to travel overland and by sea from the far eastern edges of the known world. And somewhere along that vast, winding route, a single power had learned to control almost all of it: the Portuguese. Through a combination of military prowess, navigational skill, and a willingness to use violence that Europeans found both shocking and quietly admirable, the Portuguese had, over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, gradually seized control of the maritime routes from Europe, around Africa, and across the Indian Ocean to the source of these riches. They had established trading posts, fortified warehouses, and naval bases at strategic choke points. They had made alliances and broken them. They had fought local rulers and merchant fleets with cannons and determination. By the time our merchant's wife was using that precious nutmeg, the Portuguese crown had achieved something extraordinary and, to every other European power, infuriating. They had created what was, in essence, a monopoly not on land, but on the sea itself. Every spice that made its way from the islands to Lisbon passed through Portuguese hands. Every merchant in Amsterdam, in Venice, in Bruges, who wanted to trade these goods had to buy them from Portuguese intermediaries at prices the Portuguese themselves set. And those prices were staggering. The markup from the Moluccas to the Portuguese warehouses was enormous. The further the spice travelled, from Lisbon to Antwerp, to the Rhine, into the German territories, north into Poland, the prices multiplied like a fever. This was the great economic wound of late 16th century Europe. Immense wealth was being extracted from the Eastern trade, yes, but most of it flowed directly into Portuguese coffers. Other merchants, other traders, other cities watched this river of money flow past them and felt something like economic starvation. They could see the riches, they could taste the spices, they could imagine the profits, but they could not access them. The sea routes were guarded, the ports were controlled. The Portuguese had, with remarkable foresight and ruthlessness, locked everyone else out. And so, in the minds of Dutch and English and French merchants, a single obsessive question began to form. Was there not another way? A passage that the Portuguese had missed? A route around the globe, perhaps, that would allow them to sail directly from their own harbours to the Spice Islands themselves, cutting out the Portuguese middleman entirely? What if the monopoly could be broken not by competing with Portuguese naval power, though some imagined that too, but by simply finding an alternative path that the Portuguese had overlooked? This question, this tantalizing possibility, became the engine that would drive the Dutch to the edges of the world and, quite incidentally, to invent the very machinery of modern financial capitalism. But before we reach that moment, before the great unified company and the first public shares, we must follow the Dutch themselves as they began to grasp at this dream, as they sent ship after ship into the unknown, searching for the path that would make them rich beyond measure and break the Portuguese stranglehold on the spices of the world. But let us step back into the world as the Dutch encountered it in the closing decades of the 16th century, a time when the Spice Islands, those distant clumps of volcanic earth scattered across the Indian Ocean, had become the most coveted prizes in all of Christendom. The Portuguese, you understand, had locked the door to this garden entirely. Under Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors, they had spent nearly a century inching down the African coast, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and finally, after Vasco da Gama's epochal voyage of 1498, they had broken through to India itself, then beyond. The Portuguese crown claimed absolute monopoly over this trade. Their ships sailed the routes, their factors managed the ports, their prices dictated what European merchants would pay for cloves and nutmeg and mace. To the Portuguese, this monopoly was not merely commercial, it was divine sanction, a reward for Christian devotion and navigational courage. The Dutch, in those years, were neither powerful at sea nor accustomed to long-distance voyaging. They were merchants and traders, yes, shrewd ones. The people of the Low Countries always had been, but they operated in northern waters, dealing in cloth and timber and grain along the Baltic and North Sea coastlines. They knew the counting house and the credit ledger far better than they knew the open ocean. Yet desperation and hunger make innovative teachers. The Portuguese monopoly meant that the spice trade, which had always filtered northward through Venice and then into northern Europe, was becoming strangled. Prices were climbing, supplies were uncertain, and the Dutch merchants, watching their profits diminish, began to ask themselves a question that would change everything. What if the monopoly could be broken? The answer seemed to lie in geography. If the Portuguese controlled the southern route, the long sail down Africa and around the Cape, then perhaps there existed another way in. Perhaps, like the Spanish seeking a westward passage to Cathay, the Dutch might discover a northerly route that would allow them to slip past Portuguese control entirely. The Arctic waters, it was whispered, might hold such a path. Or perhaps, and here the maps grew vague and speculative, bleeding into fantasy, an inland passage through the frozen north of Russia and Siberia might lead toward Cathay and the Indies beyond. These were not entirely unreasonable hopes. The world in 1590 was still large with mystery. Maps were incomplete, coastlines were inaccurate. A passage might exist anywhere in the unmapped wilderness. And so the Dutch began to send expeditions northward, driven by a mingling of hope and calculation. The voyages began quietly, almost tentatively. These were not the lavishly funded expeditions of crown princes. These were merchant ventures, organized by wealthy traders pooling resources, hiring skilled navigators, provisioning small fleets with enough supplies to endure months of frigid exploration. One thinks of Willem Barents, the Dutch navigator whose name would later be given to a sea, setting out with small ships into the Barents Sea in the 1590s, pushing north of Novaya Zemlya into waters where the ice pressed down like a closing fist, where the sun hung in perpetual summer or perpetual darkness, depending on the season, and the cold was a presence so absolute it seemed almost alive. He was searching, as so many were, for the Northeast Passage, that theoretical highway through Arctic waters that would lead from Europe around the north of Russia and Siberia directly to the Pacific and thence to the Indies. One can imagine, even now, the peculiar mixture of sensations such voyages must have entailed. The sailors would have experienced the world in a way that those who remained in Amsterdam could scarcely comprehend. The long weeks at sea, the constant motion beneath your feet, the horizon stretching in all directions with nothing but water and sky. Then, as they pressed north, the gradual transformation of the ocean itself, the ice appearing first in small flows, then thickening, then becoming a solid presence that the ships had to navigate through with desperate care, the hulls creaking and groaning as the ice pressed against them. The temperature dropping day by day until the very air seemed to crystallize, and the moisture in your breath froze instantly upon leaving your lips. These expeditions yielded something approaching knowledge about the Arctic, though the knowledge was often purchased dearly. They proved that a northeast passage, if it existed at all, was impenetrable. The ice would not yield, the passages would not open. Ship after ship returned frostbitten and damaged, crews decimated by scurvy and cold, their maps marked with newly discovered coastlines but no breakthrough, no miraculous route to the Indies. Yet in a curious way, these failures were essential. They redirected Dutch ambition away from the impossible Arctic and toward something far more achievable, the direct route that the Portuguese themselves had already pioneered. If you could not find a new path, then perhaps you simply had to take the old path, despite Portuguese opposition. And here we encounter the subtle shift in Dutch strategy and temperament. Rather than seeking a mythical northern route, Dutch merchants and seafarers began to accept that they would have to challenge Portuguese dominion directly. The East India Company, which would emerge from the chaos of the next decade, was thus born not from gentle calculation, but from the ashes of failed exploration, from the recognition that the Indies could only be reached by sailing where the Portuguese sailed, competing where they competed, and being willing to match their cannons, their cunning, and their merchants' ruthlessness with their own. But that consolidation lay still in the future. For now, in the 1590s, what existed was rather a loose constellation of Dutch merchant houses, each organizing its own expeditions, each hoping to crack open the Portuguese monopoly through whatever means lay at hand. Some sent ships around the Cape following the Portuguese route, a voyage that took months, cost enormous sums, and could be repaid only if the cargo arrived safely and spices could be sold at a profit before the next Portuguese fleet depressed the market. Others invested in smaller ventures, privateering expeditions that targeted Portuguese ships on the high seas, transforming the spice trade into something approaching open warfare. This was the moment of chaos before unity, the era of proliferating voyages and competing interests that would eventually exhaust themselves and demand a solution. Each merchant house wanted dominion, each captain wanted glory and profit. Each expedition added knowledge of the routes, the winds, the methods required to succeed in this distant trade. And yet each expedition also scattered Dutch resources, divided their naval strength, and prevented them from mounting the kind of coordinated assault on the Portuguese monopoly that might have been truly decisive. It was inefficiency on a grand scale, and it was precisely this inefficiency that would prompt the great consolidation of 1602. Picture the Amsterdam docks in the 1590s, not the unified, orderly harbour of later years, but something far more feverish. Merchant houses scattered across the city, each one nursing the same obsession: the Indies, the spices, the wealth that seemed to be flowing into Portuguese hands like water through cupped palms. And so, without coordination, without agreement, these rival traders began outfitting their own ships. The de Houtman brothers, Cornelis and Frederick, commissioned a fleet. Somewhere else in the city, merchants with surnames now lost to time were doing the same. The Amsterdam Company of Farlands, the Middelburg Chamber, the Enkhuizen traders, each one convinced that speed and secrecy were their advantages. Each one believing that if they could just launch their vessels before anyone else, they might steal that first profitable voyage, that crucial foothold in Java or the Moluccas, where the nutmeg and cloves grew wild like weeds in a garden only the Portuguese had managed to fence. What resulted was something almost poetic in its inefficiency. Imagine the waste. Here were men with the same destination, the same hunger, the same risks, yet they bid against each other for the same scarce shipwrights, the same timber, the same provisions. Pepper prices in Amsterdam fluctuated wildly with each rumor of an arriving vessel. The cost of hiring a ship's crew tripled, then quadrupled, as multiple merchants competed for the most experienced sailors. A man who could navigate by the stars found himself courted by 4 different captains, each offering better wages than the last. The first Dutch expeditions did return with spices. Cornelis de Houtman, Despite losing a ship and a portion of his crew to Portuguese aggression in the Strait of Sunda, came back in 1599 with goods that sold for enormous sums. But here was the cruel paradox. Success only fed the frenzy. Yes, he had profitable cargo, but his voyage had cost thousands of guilders. The outlay was so immense, the risks so grave, that even a successful return barely compensated the investors. And what did that success breed? More competitors, more ships, more chaos. By the turn of the century, perhaps a dozen or more separate Dutch trading companies were fitting out vessels for the Indies. Each one thought itself clever, strategic, unique. Each one imagined its route would be faster, its crew more loyal, its cargo more negotiable. But from a higher vantage point, the perspective of economics and logic, it all looked rather like watching men pour water through sieves while standing beside a leaking pool. The money was flowing everywhere at once, draining away into the ocean and into the coffers of rival companies. The accounts from this period whisper of something almost frantic. Merchants would encounter each other at the exchange, for Amsterdam had a gathering place for traders even then, and they would speak with barely concealed resentment. They were all chasing the same dream, yet each one was his own competitor. A widow in Amsterdam, who might have invested her inheritance, had to choose between the Middelburg Company and the Amsterdam Company and the De Houtman venture, each one promising riches, each one concealing the enormous uncertainty of a voyage that might take 2 years or might end in disaster off the Cape of Good Hope. How could she possibly know which to trust? The redundancy was spectacular. Ships with nearly identical hulls were built simultaneously in competing shipyards. Identical routes were being planned in different counting houses, each commander thinking he alone had discovered the safest passage through the Sunda Strait. Spices that arrived in Amsterdam from one company's successful voyage would glut the market just as another company's ship was setting sail, ensuring that by the time the second voyage completed, prices had collapsed. And beneath this economic chaos ran something darker still. These rival companies began to view each other not merely as competitors, but as threats. There are whispers, documented in merchant letters, of intentional espionage. One captain might have bribed a dock worker to learn which company was fitting out the next fleet, hoping to time his own departure to create a more favorable market moment. Sailors switching loyalty between companies were not uncommon. A man might sign aboard one vessel, then accept better terms and desert to another. Trust became rare. It was measured in contracts and money, not in fellowship. The Portuguese, watching from their positions of established power in the east, could only smile at this Dutch chaos. Here were these upstart northerners, all energy and hunger, yet they were eating themselves. While the Dutch merchants squabbled over cargo rights and route monopolies, while they outbid each other for supplies and crew, the Portuguese monopoly remained intact. The Spice Islands still flowed with their wealth, still belonged to them by right of arms and prior claim. What did it matter if a few Dutch ships made it through to the Indies? As long as the Dutch remained divided, they were merely nuisances. Persistent, expensive nuisances, but manageable. Yet within this very chaos lay the seeds of something that would transform not just Dutch trade, but the entire world. The fragmentation, the waste, the duplication of effort and capital, all of it would eventually drive thinking men to a realization that no one had quite articulated yet, not in this way. What if there were a different model? What if instead of rivals bleeding each other dry, there were a way to combine resources, to merge risk, to unite capital under a single structure powerful enough to challenge Portuguese hegemony while still offering returns to investors who didn't have to outfit their own ships? The answer was not yet visible on the harbour, but it was forming in the minds of Amsterdam's merchant princes, and the very pain of this competitive chaos would become the pressure that forged it. And here is where the story takes a quieter, more deliberate turn. For years, the Dutch merchants had competed against one another with an intensity that burned through capital and courage in equal measure. Small companies sent ships across the same dangerous waters, bidding against each other for the same spices, the same routes, the same slim chance at survival and profit. Picture it: multiple Dutch fleets rounding the Cape of Good Hope at nearly the same moment, all seeking to break into the same harbours, all hoping to undercut Portuguese prices, all risking everything on the mathematics of competition rather than the mathematics of cooperation. By the turn of the century, this chaos had become unsustainable. The costs of fitting a single ship for the voyage to the East Indies were staggering. Timber, canvas, rope, provisions, crew wages, insurance against the seemingly infinite ways a vessel might be lost to storm or scurvy, or the Portuguese cannons that still commanded the crucial passages. A merchant family might spend what amounted to their entire fortune on a single voyage, knowing that one bad year, one lost fleet, could erase generations of accumulated wealth in a matter of months. The mathematics of this fragmentation had begun to trap the Dutch in a pattern where they were, paradoxically, competing themselves into poverty. The Dutch government understood this in a way that many governments do not. Rather than allow the marketplace to sort itself out through the slow erosion of weaker competitors, the authorities in The Hague made a calculated decision that would alter the course of financial history. They would consolidate, they would unite, and in doing so, they would create something entirely new. In the year 1602, on the 20th of March, the Dutch States General issued a charter that brought together the various competing trading companies, the Amsterdam Company, the Middelburg Company, the Rotterdam Company, and several others, into a single entity with a name that would echo through centuries: the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, the VOC. This was not a gentle merger, not a coming together of equals in a spirit of brotherhood. It was a government-mandated consolidation, a decree from above that these companies could no longer operate in isolation. But what made it revolutionary? What made it different from the simple military or political unions that had been negotiated before was the method by which it was structured. The VOC was not merely unified on paper, it was unified through the most elegant financial mechanism yet devised, the Joint Stock Company, a form of organization that would transform commerce forever. The charter granted the VOC a monopoly over all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. No other Dutch merchant could sail those routes. No other company could trade those goods. This monopoly was the carrot, the promise that justified the consolidation. The stick, meanwhile, was the requirement that all the capital needed to operate this vast enterprise be pooled together, shared among the participating merchants and investors, and divided into transferable shares. Let us pause on this moment, because it is easy to move past without grasping what had just been invented. For the first time in the history of commerce, a company of this scale and ambition had been structured not as a partnership where individuals owned discrete slices, but as a corporation where ownership could be divided into small, equal units that could be bought and sold. The VOC would raise capital not from a handful of wealthy merchants, but from hundreds, perhaps thousands of individual investors, each contributing what they could afford, each owning a piece of a collective enterprise. The initial capital call was for 6 million guilders, an almost incomprehensible sum for the time. But here is the genius, that 6 million guilders would not need to come from a single source, or even a dozen sources. It could come from hundreds of sources. A wealthy merchant might invest 50,000 guilders. A widow with modest savings might invest 500. A baker with surplus capital might invest 1,000. Each would own a percentage of the whole, each would bear a proportional share of the risk, and each would receive a proportional share of the profits when ships returned laden with spices and silks and the other treasures of the distant East. This principle, the distribution of risk and reward across many shoulders, was not entirely new in the world of trade. Merchants had long shared the burden of voyages through various schemes and partnerships, but the VOC's innovation was in the permanence and the transferability. Previous ventures had been temporary arrangements, lasting only as long as a single voyage lasted. When the ship returned, the company dissolved. The investors received their share and moved on to the next opportunity. The VOC, by contrast, was permanent. It was chartered for an indefinite period, with no expectation that it would ever dissolve, and the shares, once issued, could be traded, sold, bequeathed, given as gifts. They became a commodity in themselves. What had been invented, without perhaps the full recognition of its significance, was a new form of wealth, portable, divisible, liquid, and perpetual. You could own a piece of a vast commercial enterprise without having to manage it yourself. You could pass your ownership to your children. You could sell it if you needed cash. You could buy more if you had extra money. The implications of this simple innovation would ripple outward in ways that no one in 1602, not even the most visionary merchant in Amsterdam, could have fully anticipated. The government's role in this consolidation must also be understood. By granting the VOC its charter, the Dutch States General was not simply blessing a corporate reorganization. They were delegating a portion of state power to a private entity. The VOC would not merely be a trading company, it would be armed. It would negotiate treaties with foreign powers. It would establish colonies. It would mint coins and maintain order across vast territories. The charter was essentially saying, you may conduct commerce, and in doing so, you may exercise certain functions that typically belong to the sovereign state itself. This blurring of the line between commerce and governance would have profound consequences, some beneficial, others tragic. But for the moment, in that early year of the 17th century, the focus was on the promise of order emerging from chaos, the promise of unified action replacing fragmented competition, the promise of sustainable profit replacing the feast or famine cycles that had plagued Dutch merchants for decades. The Dutch merchants and investors who purchased shares in the VOC at its founding were, whether they fully realized it or not, participating in an experiment in human organization. They were creating a new way for wealth to be accumulated, distributed, and managed. They were establishing a precedent that would inspire companies and investors for centuries to come, and they were setting in motion a chain of events that would make Amsterdam, for the next 2 centuries, the financial capital of the world. And so when those rival merchants finally gathered in the candlelit halls of Amsterdam in the early months of 1602, they were not simply signing a charter. They were, whether they fully understood it in that moment, inventing a form of organized enterprise that would reshape how humans could imagine risk, ownership, and collective ambition across oceans and centuries. The structure they agreed upon that year contained something entirely new. Before the VOC, when a merchant sent a ship to the east, he owned that ship. He bore all the risk. If the vessel sank in a storm off the Cape of Good Hope, or if it was captured by Portuguese corsairs, or if the crew succumbed to disease in the humid months at sea, the loss belonged to him alone. It was absolute. His family might be ruined. His fortune could evaporate into salt water and tropical fever. And if the ship returned laden with spices, yes, the profit was his too. But so was every uncertainty between departure and homecoming. A single voyage could mean prosperity or destitution. There was no spreading the danger. There was no sharing the burden. The VOC, by contrast, operated on a principle of shared permanent capital. Instead of financing individual voyages that dissolved into profit or loss, the company established a fund of continuous money. Merchants and investors could buy shares in this perpetual enterprise, not shares in a single voyage, shares in the institution itself. Do you hear the difference? A widow in Amsterdam with a modest purse could now give capital to the VOC, receive a certificate documenting her ownership, and her portion of risk, and her portion of potential gain, would stretch across multiple voyages, multiple years, multiple routes. If one ship sank, her investment did not vanish. The company absorbed the loss across its whole portfolio. The risk was diluted, distributed, made survivable for ordinary people. This was revolutionary because it solved a problem that had haunted commerce for centuries. How could a merchant undertake ventures so enormous, so perilous, so distant, that no individual could reasonably bear the full weight of failure? How could the spice trade, which required dozens of ships, hundreds of sailors, months of provisions, navigation instruments, cartography, how could that be financed by single families? It couldn't, and yet it had to be. The appetite for cloves and nutmeg in Europe was insatiable. Kings wanted the spices, apothecaries needed them, wealthy households paid extraordinary sums. The demand pulled harder and harder at Dutch ambition, but the peril remained impossibly vast. By pooling capital into a permanent fund, the VOC created what we might call, in the gentler language of modern finance, a diversified portfolio. Though merchants in 1602 would not have used that phrase, they would have simply felt a quieting of dread. When a shareholder owned a portion of the company, she owned a stake in the entire enterprise. Perhaps 5 ships sailed that season. Perhaps 2 returned safely laden with spices worth triple their voyage cost. Perhaps 1 sank. Perhaps 1 was delayed by pirates. The widow's modest investment was spread across the possibility. She might profit, she might lose, but the loss, if it came, would not obliterate her. The shares themselves, physical pieces of paper, beautifully written, with the company's seal, these became property that could be bought and sold. A merchant who had invested 50 guilders at the company's founding could, should his fortune improve or his needs change, sell his share to another investor, or to several, if his share was fractional. The ownership was transferable. This meant capital need not be locked away for years. It could move. It could find new owners who believed in the enterprise more fervently or who simply had use for their money elsewhere. And as shares passed from hand to hand, their price would rise or fall depending on the news from Asia, the health of the company's fleets, the success of its trading posts, the rumors whispered in Amsterdam's coffee houses. Why does this matter so deeply? Because it meant that ownership in a vast, risky, distant enterprise was no longer the province of princes and patrician families who could absorb catastrophic loss. It became available to merchants of moderate means, to guild masters, to ship captains with savings, to successful artisans, perhaps even to widows managing inheritances, perhaps to clergy reinvesting donations. The circle of those who could participate in overseas commerce, who could share in its profits, who could bear its risks, that circle suddenly expanded. Democracy of a kind, though not political democracy, financial democracy, the democracy of the share. The VOC itself, as an institution, was governed by directors elected by major shareholders. The largest investors had the most say, certainly. Wealth granted influence. But the principle was novel even in its inequality. The company did not belong to a king. It did not belong to a single merchant prince or a family dynasty. It belonged, fractionally and in varying degrees, to whoever held shares. And that meant dozens, hundreds, eventually thousands, a multitude of owners, each with a stake, each receiving regular reports on the company's progress, each hoping for dividends, each vulnerable to loss. For the first time in commercial history, an enterprise of enormous scale, one requiring fleets, fortresses, armies, trade monopolies across continents, had been organized as a collective venture sustained by many owners of limited means. The VOC borrowed money, certainly. It negotiated with Dutch authorities. It assembled professional management. But its fundamental capital, the money that paid for ships and cargo and wages, came from a distributed base of shareholders whose combined wealth created something none of them could have managed alone. And this structure, once established in Amsterdam in 1602, would prove to be not just practical, but contagious. Other Dutch merchants, observing the VOC's success, would propose similar companies for different regions. The Dutch East India Company for the Eastern trade. Other nations would eventually adopt the model. England would create its own East India Company, chartered differently, but built on the principle of shared capital and transferable shares. France would follow. By the 18th century, the joint stock company, that is, a company whose ownership was divided into shares that could be traded, had become the dominant form for large-scale enterprise in Europe. Not the norm yet, but the future, the shape of what commerce would become. And on quiet mornings, when the mist was still thick over Amsterdam's canals, when a baker buying his first share of the VOC from a street vendor or a banker's clerk might reflect on what he held in his hands, a slip of paper, a certificate of ownership, a fraction of a vast apparatus of wealth and peril stretching toward distant islands he would never see, he was, unknowingly, holding the future of capitalism itself. Not capitalism as ideology or politics, but capitalism as method, as structure, as a way of organizing large ambitions through distributed risk and private ownership. The VOC had not invented the idea out of nothing. Portuguese merchants, Venetian bankers, Genoese traders, all had found ways to pool capital across generations and voyages. But the VOC made the system explicit, permanent, transferable, available to the ordinary merchant with modest means, and from that moment forward, the world would know a new way to dream. And so the charter was signed. The rivals became one company, the United East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, a name that would soon echo across every trading port from Lisbon to London. But there was a problem hidden within this magnificent solution, one that would transform not just the company, but the very nature of how human beings would come to own things together. The VOC needed capital, enormous, staggering amounts of it. Ships cost money, cargo cost money, provisions for months at sea, wages for crew, fortifications in distant lands where no European law could protect you. The company's directors estimated they would need 6 million guilders to launch their first armada. 6 million. That was roughly equivalent to the entire annual tax revenue of Portugal at the time, a sum so vast that no single merchant, no matter how wealthy, could supply it alone. And here is where something genuinely revolutionary began to take root. The directors of the VOC understood, perhaps not with complete clarity, but with a kind of intuitive genius, that they could divide the company itself into pieces. Not physically, you understand, but on paper. They could create certificates of ownership. Each piece would represent a proportional claim to the company's future profits, its ships, its cargoes, its very being. These pieces could be bought and sold. They could pass from one person's hands to another. They could be inherited. They could sit in a widow's strongbox while her life continued. And here was the true innovation. These pieces need not be held until the ships returned. They could change owners while the expedition was still at sea, while years of voyage still remained, while no dividend had yet been earned. The share, as it came to be called, had been born. Now, you might ask, had no one thought of this before? The answer is more subtle than a simple no. There had been partnerships, certainly. There had been ventures where merchants pooled resources. But the VOC did something different. They created shares that were not merely contractual agreements between known parties. They created shares that were standardized, that could be transferred without the consent of other shareholders, that could be traded like commodities themselves. And they created them in such quantities and distributed them so widely that they could absorb capital from across an entire city. The company issued shares worth 1,000 guilders each, not insignificant sums, and yet not impossible for merchants, craftspeople, and the moderately wealthy to acquire. In 1602, these shares began to be bought and sold. At first, the trading happened in the streets, in homes, in the offices of merchants who acted as informal brokers. But by 1608, something extraordinary crystallized into being. The Amsterdam Bourse opened its doors. The Bourse, or Börse in Dutch, was not exactly a building in the way you might imagine a stock exchange today. It was rather a covered arcade, an open portico where merchants gathered, where prices were called out, where deals were struck in the shadow of stone columns. Picture it, the sound of raised voices, the rustle of papers, men in dark clothes and wide-brimmed hats gesturing, nodding, shaking hands to seal transactions. The light filtering through the openings cast long shadows. The smell of ink from freshly written contracts mingled with the salt air drifting up from the canals. It was a place of both order and chaos, of mathematics and human passion. What made the Bourse revolutionary was not the building itself, it was what it represented. For perhaps the first time in human history, there existed a place where ordinary people could go and trade pieces of a vast enterprise they did not own in their entirety. An enterprise whose operations they might never fully understand, whose officers they might never meet, whose ships they might never see. You could buy a share of the VOC if you had saved enough money. You could watch its price rise and fall. You could sell it at a profit or suffer a loss. You could make decisions about what to buy based on rumors, on your assessment of the ship captains, on whispers about new discoveries in the Indies. You could participate in something larger than yourself and hope for returns. This, in its most fundamental form, was the stock market being born. The prices at the Amsterdam Bourse were recorded, printed, and distributed. This was crucial. Without the printing press, that technology that had revolutionized Europe a century earlier, the stock market could never have grown as it did. Information is the lifeblood of markets. The moment you print a price list and distribute it beyond those who were present when the transaction occurred, you democratize knowledge. A merchant in Rotterdam could read about the price of VOC shares in Amsterdam. A baker in Utrecht could learn how the market moved last week. This circulation of information transformed individual transactions into something collective, something that began to take on a life of its own. The price no longer belonged only to the two people making the trade. It belonged to the market. It belonged to everyone. And so the shares traded. They rose and fell with news from distant horizons. A letter from Java arrived by ship. The coffee crop had failed. Prices fell. Rumors spread that a new cargo of spices was returning to Amsterdam. Prices rose. The first investors in VOC shares were not mere speculators. Many of them were ordinary people seeking security, seeking a way to make their modest savings work for them, seeking a claim on the future prosperity of distant lands they would never visit. They were widows needing income, merchants diversifying their risk, guild members pooling their craft earnings. They were the people who would, centuries later, become the foundation of the modern world's investing classes. But they did not yet know it. They simply knew that here, in Amsterdam, there existed a place where you could buy a piece of the future, and the future, it seemed, was rising with the tide. Picture, if you will, a printing house somewhere in Amsterdam around the turn of the 17th century. The air is thick with the smell of ink and paper, and through the large windows facing the canal, the pale northern light catches the dust particles rising from fresh sheets. A compositor sits at his frame, placing individual metal letters with deliberate fingers, each tiny piece of type locked into place to form words, lines, entire pages about something that had never before needed to be printed: the price of shares, the value of traded goods, the fluctuating fortunes of the VOC itself. Before the printing press, information moved slowly, carried in the memories of merchants or in hastily scrawled letters that took weeks to cross Europe. A spice trader in Lisbon might learn of a price change in Amsterdam only after the market had shifted 3 times over. But Gutenberg's invention, perfected and refined over more than a century, created something unprecedented: the possibility of spreading identical information to hundreds of people almost simultaneously. And nowhere did this technology find more urgent application than in the financial houses of Amsterdam. The VOC's shares needed prices. Those prices needed to be known, and soon someone realized that if you could print a price list, a simple sheet showing what VOC shares sold for on Tuesday, or what the latest cargo of nutmeg and cloves might fetch when the fleet returned, you could send it across the city, across the Netherlands, even across the sea to other trading ports. These price lists began as modest things, often just columnar tables printed on single sheets, sometimes with woodcut illustrations showing ships in full sail or the exotic spice islands rendered in imaginative detail. A historian might hesitate and say we cannot be entirely certain which price lists predated others, but the evidence suggests that by the second decade of the 1600s, regular bulletins of market prices were circulating through Amsterdam's merchant quarters and coffee houses. What is it about seeing a number in print that makes it feel more real, more trustworthy? There may be something in the human mind that grants printed information a kind of authority it lacks when merely spoken aloud. A merchant could hold a printed price list in his hand, show it to his wife, discuss it with neighbors at the market. The number was no longer the opinion of a single trader. It was documented, made permanent, distributed. And in that distribution lay a subtle but revolutionary transformation: the birth of what we might gently call shared market awareness. The pamphlets went deeper still. Some were small treatises explaining how the VOC worked, how shares could be purchased, what dividends might be expected. These were not purely informational. They often served as promotional materials, written by supporters of the company who wanted to attract new investors. But nestled among the enthusiasm and the rosy projections of future wealth, there were facts, lists of ships, descriptions of routes, accounts of the cargoes that had already returned. A widow in Amsterdam, or a baker with some spare guilders, could read one of these pamphlets and begin to form his or her own sense of what the VOC actually was, what risks it carried, what rewards it promised. The printing press created, in other words, the possibility of an informed public. Not perfectly informed, propaganda was rife, exaggeration common, and false rumor still spread as quickly as truth, but informed in a way that had never existed before. When someone could point to a printed price and say, "Look, the shares rose 2% this week," others could verify it, compare it to last week's list, trace a pattern over time. The act of seeing numbers accumulate in print over days and weeks and months began to create something else: the sense of a market, an entity with moods and movements, something that could be studied, anticipated, perhaps even influenced. There is a gentle irony here in how innovation compounds upon innovation. The printing press had democratized access to religious texts and classical literature. It had enabled the spread of scientific knowledge, the sharing of maps and navigational charts that made the very voyages of the VOC possible. And now it was being turned towards something more intimate: the recording and distribution of everyday economic life. A farmer in the Dutch countryside, previously isolated from the world of merchant finance, could now, if he learned to read and found a coin to buy a pamphlet, glimpse the great machinery of international commerce turning in distant Amsterdam. Yet this same technology also created its own peculiar problems. As more people gained access to price information, more people developed opinions about where prices ought to go next. Printed speculation began to circulate alongside printed facts. Someone would print a pamphlet claiming that the next fleet would be especially rich with spices, and this optimism would spread, would be discussed in coffee houses, would influence buying decisions. Other pamphleteers would counter with warnings of piracy, of storms, of Portuguese interference. The market began to respond not only to actual news arriving from Asia, a voyage lost to pirates, a warehouse burned, a successful auction, but to the circulation of rumor made tangible in printed form. The printers themselves became important figures, though their names are largely forgotten now. They were gatekeepers of sorts, deciding which price lists to publish, which pamphlets to print, which rumors to give physical form to. There is something worth pausing on in this role. The human decision to say, this information is important enough to lock into type and run through the press. It made the ephemeral permanent, the spoken word documented, the private conviction public. By mid-century, a visitor to Amsterdam's harbour or its financial quarter would find the ground scattered with these papers, price lists blown by the wind, pamphlets tucked under arms, posters nailed to walls advertising the latest information about sailings and expected returns. The clatter of printing presses became, in a very real sense, the sound of capitalism being born, not the sound of money changing hands directly, that remained largely silent, but the sound of information being manufactured, distributed, becoming the shared substance upon which decisions were made. And so here we find a strange collaboration between two great technologies, the printing press allowing the printing of market prices, and those prices in turn creating a new kind of reality, one in which thousands of people, most of whom would never see a spice plant or step foot on a VOC ship, could nonetheless feel themselves participating in a grand commercial enterprise. They read the prices, felt the small excitement of watching their investment fluctuate, discussed the news with others who had also read the latest pamphlet. In this way, the printing press did not merely report on the stock market, it helped to create it, to make it real, to weave it into the daily consciousness of ordinary people across the Netherlands. And so the machinery of the bourse began to turn, but the true revolution, the thing that would ripple forward through centuries, was not merely that shares existed, it was that anyone could own them. The ledgers of the early VOC tell a story that feels almost intimate when you lean close enough to listen. They whisper of lives we might otherwise never know. Picture, if you will, a widow named Magdalena, living in a modest house on the Herengracht Canal, her husband a cloth merchant who had died some years before, leaving her with a modest inheritance and the question that all widows of means must face, how to make the small fortune last. She had heard the talk in the marketplace, the murmurs of profit, the excitement that rippled through Amsterdam like wind across water. Her neighbour, a baker named Peter, who had saved for 2 decades, was speaking of buying shares. Not dozens of them, perhaps 5, perhaps 10, amounts that felt manageable, proportionate to the savings of a man who worked with his hands. The VOC share, in its earliest years, was not the preserve of kings or merchant princes alone. This was the quiet genius of the structure. A typical share might be purchased for anywhere between 500 and 1,000 guilders, a significant sum certainly, but not an impossible one for a skilled tradesman or a woman with inherited wealth. Think on what that meant. A baker earning perhaps 30 or 40 guilders a month could, by saving carefully for a year or two, accumulate enough to buy a single share. And that share, that small piece of paper registered in a ledger, would entitle him to a proportion of the profits. His money would voyage to the Indies without him. It would sit in warehouses in Java. It would return as cloves and nutmeg, as pepper and silk, and he would receive dividends. The psychological shift here cannot be overstated. Wealth was no longer something that only accumulated through land ownership or through being born into a merchant family with established trading networks. It could be assembled, brick by brick, share by share, by the patient accumulation of ordinary people. A grocer might own 3 shares, a schoolmaster might own 2, a widow might own 4, her capital spread across multiple holdings to reduce the danger. We can imagine them, these ordinary Amsterdammers, gathering in the bourse, on exchange days, studying the price lists that were beginning to be printed and circulated through the city, watching the numbers climb and fall, experiencing for perhaps the first time in human history that peculiar anxiety and hope that comes from owning a piece of something distant and grand. The price lists themselves became objects of intense scrutiny. Remember that the printing press had already transformed Europe, and now those presses turned their attention to finance. Pamphlets were printed weekly, then more frequently, detailing the prices at which shares had traded, the rumors from returning ships, the conditions of the weather that might affect voyage times. A baker's wife might receive one of these pamphlets at the market. A merchant's clerk might post one on the notice board at the guild hall. Information, imperfect though it was, flowed through Amsterdam like never before, and it flowed through the consciousness of ordinary people. There are surviving records, fragmentary though they may be, that hint at the diversity of the shareholder base. The registers of the VOC show women as substantial investors, which is remarkable for the period. Some were widows, certainly, investing inherited wealth, but some were married women investing money they had earned or saved themselves, a legal peculiarity that existed in certain Dutch jurisdictions and was relatively progressive for the time. There were clergymen holding small portfolios of shares. There were minor nobility diversifying their wealth beyond land. There were retired merchants looking for stable returns. And there was always the hope, wasn't there? That quiet, persistent hope. Perhaps a sailor returning from the Indies would carry a letter, written in cramped handwriting, describing the bounty of the Spice Islands, the endless warehouses of nutmeg and mace. These letters would be read aloud in taverns, and a man nursing his beer would calculate the math in his head. If the ship makes it back, if the cargo sells for the expected price, if the VOC declares the dividend they promised, if. But the mathematical probability seemed to favor those who held shares. The company was profitable. More ships meant more cargo meant more profit. The logic seemed almost irresistible. There is something poignant in imagining these ordinary investors, because they were, in a sense, the test case for something entirely new. They were participating in an experiment in risk distribution and capital formation without knowing it. Each person who bought a share was making a rational economic calculation, but collectively, these thousands of decisions, to invest, to hold, to sell, to buy more, were creating something that had never existed before. A true market, a mechanism by which capital could flow toward the projects that seemed most profitable, where the wisdom and folly of many minds could be aggregated into prices. We might wonder, would Magdalena have understood that the modest sum she invested in the VOC would help establish a model that would, centuries later, become the foundation of modern finance across the entire world? The documents suggest that these ordinary investors experienced both the exhilaration and the anxiety that the modern shareholder would come to know intimately. When news arrived of a successful voyage, when rumors spread that a particularly profitable cargo was expected, the price would rise, and holders of shares would feel a deep satisfaction. They had been right. They had seen the opportunity. There were men and women who bought shares at lower prices and sold them higher, pocketing the difference, experiencing what we might call the first rush of market speculation available to the common person. Conversely, when news was bad, when a ship was delayed, when rumors spread of Portuguese interference with Dutch vessels, when any whisper of danger to the trading network emerged, prices would soften. Anxiety would ripple through the city. The bourse itself, during these early years, was a place where this human drama played out. The physical exchange on the Rokin, where dealers gathered and prices were called out, became a theatre of hope and fear. Men in long coats and women in careful dress would cluster around the traders, watching the shifting quotations, listening to the news that arrived by ship and courier. The rituals of modern markets, the urgent conversations, the rapid adjustments of prices, the sudden shifts in mood, all of these were being born in Amsterdam in the early years of the 17th century, and the cast of characters was far more diverse than one might expect from an age before mass democracy, before mass education, before any of the apparatus we think of as enabling popular participation in finance. What made this possible, ultimately, was simplicity of access and the promise of proportional return. Anyone with a modest sum could buy a share, and that share would be treated, in theory, the same as every other share. A widow's 5 shares were the same as a wealthy merchant's 5 shares. They had the same voting rights, though voting rights were sometimes exercised by proxy. They received the same dividends. The promise was democratic, even if the Dutch society of the time was rigidly hierarchical in many ways. In the matter of the VOC share, at least, a baker and a nobleman stood on theoretically equal ground. This is what would prove, across the centuries, to be the most revolutionary aspect of the entire structure. Not that shares existed, but that they were accessible, that ordinary people could own pieces of grand enterprises, that the risk and reward of distant voyages could be distributed across thousands of individual holders, each bearing a small portion of the danger in exchange for a small proportion of the profits. The widow Magdalena, the baker Peter, the schoolmaster, the grocer, they were not merely investors in the VOC, they were early participants in the mechanism that would eventually reshape global capitalism itself. They could not have known it. But their quiet decisions to invest their savings, their willingness to trust the ledgers and the traders and the returning ships, these small acts of faith were building something that would outlast empires and reshape the way human beings accumulated and distributed capital across the globe. Within a single generation of its charter, the VOC had transformed from a consortium of quarreling merchants into something far more ambitious, a force that would stretch across entire continents and reshape the map of human settlement itself. The shares that widows and bakers had purchased in Amsterdam were no longer merely financial instruments, but tiny fragments of an enormous web extending eastward, across thousands of miles of open ocean, toward territories that most European minds could barely imagine. The Spice Islands themselves, those legendary Moluccas, had always existed in a kind of mythic haze in European consciousness. For centuries, Portuguese traders had guarded the secret passages to reach them, hoarding the knowledge of monsoon winds and safe harbours. But the VOC, armed with superior cartography, relentless ambition, and the vast capital that came from its shareholders, began methodically establishing footholds throughout the Indonesian archipelago. Java emerged as the jewel in this expansion, a land of rich soils and established ports, already threaded with networks of local traders and sultanates who had been exchanging goods for centuries before any European vessel appeared on the horizon. What the VOC recognized, perhaps more clearly than its Portuguese predecessors, was that controlling a spice trade required more than occasional trading posts. It required infrastructure. It required permanence. And so in 1609, on the northwestern coast of Java, on the banks of a river called the Siliwung, the company began construction on a fortress city. The site was swampy, humid, fever-ridden. Thousands of workers, many coerced or enslaved, labored in conditions that would today seem unspeakably brutal. The fortress walls rose. Streets were carved into the jungle. Warehouses were built to store the accumulating wealth, cloves and nutmeg and mace, those precious substances that made fortunes in Europe and were worth, pound for pound, sometimes more than gold. This city, which they named Batavia, became the administrative heart of everything the VOC would construct in Asia. It was designed in the Dutch manner, with canals and orderly grids, as if to impose a European order upon an entirely different world. Batavia was not merely a trading post, you understand. It was a colony in the fullest sense, a place where Dutch merchants could establish families, where Dutch law could be imposed, where the company could govern not just commerce but the lives and fates of everyone within its jurisdiction. From Batavia, the VOC's reach extended outward in concentric rings of influence and control. Ships sailed to Ambon, to the Banda Islands, to Sumatra and Borneo. The company began to understand that the spice trade was not simply about finding goods and bringing them home. It was about controlling production itself. If nutmeg trees grew only in the Banda Islands, then the VOC reasoned perhaps they could limit which trees were planted, how much was harvested, when shipments left for Europe. This realization, that scarcity could be manufactured, that supply could be artificially constrained to keep prices high, was crucial. It represented an early form of what we might now call monopolistic control, though the term did not yet exist. Consider what this meant for the ordinary person in Amsterdam who owned 20 shares of the VOC. That person, sitting in a modest home on a narrow street, had become a micro-investor in a territorial enterprise spanning continents. The cloves that arrived in European ports, the nutmeg that appeared in merchant stalls, the vast wealth that accumulated in the company's coffers, all of these distant realities were, in some small way, connected to their ownership stake. The distance was enormous, the reality of what that control meant, largely invisible. What they knew was that dividends appeared regularly. The company was prosperous. The shares could be sold for more than they cost. There is something almost dreamlike about considering this network from the perspective of 17th century consciousness. News traveled slowly. A letter from Batavia to Amsterdam took 4 to 8 months to arrive, crossing deserts and oceans, subject to storms and pirates, and the simple uncertainties of long-distance maritime travel. Most investors in VOC shares would never see the places their money was creating. They would never witness Batavia's construction, or walk its ordered streets, or smell the spice warehouses that lined its harbour. Yet their capital was there. Their ownership stretched across the world, invisible but absolute. The Moluccas, those islands that had glowed in the European imagination for so long, were now, for all practical purposes, Dutch territory. The indigenous peoples who had cultivated clove trees for centuries, who had developed the knowledge and labor systems that made the spice trade possible, were now subjects of the VOC rather than independent merchants. This transformation happened gradually, then suddenly, depending on the perspective one takes. Wars were fought. Some sultanates submitted peacefully. Others resisted fiercely. The company responded with the firepower of its ships, the professionalism of its soldiers, the sheer weight of resources that could be brought to bear. One might pause here and ask, what did the shareholders imagine when they thought of their investment? Did they picture lush spice plantations? Did they understand themselves as participating in the transformation of distant societies? Or was it simpler and more abstract? Mere numbers, dividends, the accumulation of wealth in an account? The answer almost certainly varies with each individual. Some shareholders were themselves merchants with detailed knowledge of what the company was building. Others were widows or small traders who simply knew that this company seemed prosperous and that their money grew. But all of them, whether knowingly or unknowingly, were participants in a vast enterprise of extraction and control. Batavia grew rapidly. By mid-century, it was a thriving city of perhaps 10,000 souls, a strange hybrid place where Dutch merchants in their heavy clothes lived in stone buildings designed for temperate climates, where Chinese merchants traded alongside Arab and Indian traders, where the company governed with absolute authority. The harbour filled with VOC ships. Markets emerged. A social hierarchy crystallized, with Dutch officials at the top, followed by free merchants and craftspeople, then enslaved workers and indigenous people. The city was a microcosm of the company's expansion, prosperous, organized, and built upon a foundation of coercion and inequality that nobody seemed to question because it was profitable. The implications of this expansion were not lost on the company's competitors. The Portuguese had once monopolized the eastern trade. Now the VOC was in the process of systematically displacing them, claiming the best islands, establishing the strongest fortifications, building the most extensive supply networks. Other European powers took notice. The English, the French, the Spanish, all began to recognize that the future of global commerce might belong to whoever could organize capital most effectively and move it most decisively across oceans. The VOC had shown the way. From the perspective of someone drifting towards sleep, there is something almost hallucinatory about this vast transformation. A company that began a few years earlier as a coalition of quarreling traders had, within decades, established a territorial empire spanning 1/3 of the world. Shares purchased in Amsterdam were generating wealth that came directly from islands thousands of miles away. The spices flowing back to Europe, and from Europe back out again to markets in the Middle East and Mediterranean, were enriching merchants and investors, and making the company itself seem almost invincible. The machinery was in place. The systems were established. All that remained was to protect what had been built, and to extend it further if the opportunities arose. But beneath the neat ledgers and the gold-trimmed shares that passed between Amsterdam's burgher hands lay a different story altogether, one written not in ink on parchment, but in the humid soil of distant islands and in the lives of those who never saw the certificate of ownership that bore their fate. The VOC's monopoly on the spice trade was not won through commerce alone. By the time the company had consolidated its power in the opening decades of the 17th century, it had begun to understand something vital, that profit could be maximized not merely through competitive pricing or efficient shipping, but through the deliberate elimination of competition itself. And so, across the Banda Islands and the clove forests of Tidore, the company set about systematizing what historians have long called a monopoly through violence, a quiet, bureaucratic brutality that felt almost inevitable to those who administered it. The spices that commanded such astronomical prices in European markets grew in only a few precise locations on Earth. The nutmeg came primarily from the Banda Islands, those tiny specks of volcanic rock scattered across the Banda Sea. The cloves flourished in a handful of islands in what is now Indonesia. When the Portuguese had controlled these routes, they had maintained their edge through coastal fortifications and naval superiority. But the VOC, with its vast capital and its mandate from the Dutch state, chose a different path. It moved inland. It moved into the islands themselves. Consider what happened in the Banda Islands in the years following 1621. The local sultanate had resisted VOC dominance, seeking to trade with multiple European powers and maintain their independence. The company's response was swift and absolute. Under the Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a figure who emerges in the historical record as both visionary entrepreneur and ruthless administrator, the VOC launched a campaign that would leave the islands depopulated and pacified. The local population, numbering perhaps 15,000, was reduced through violence, enslavement, and expulsion to barely a few thousand. Those who resisted were executed. Those who remained were stripped of their land and forced into labor systems that bore all the characteristics of slavery, though the VOC preferred other names for it. What is striking, when one examines the correspondence of this period, is how matter-of-factly the violence was recorded. Company letters speak of the pacification of the islands in the same tone that they might discuss the repair of a warehouse roof. The shareholders in Amsterdam counting their dividends and the rising value of their shares, were several months' voyage away from these events. The separation of ownership from consequence. This was perhaps the VOC's most enduring innovation. The company established what it called Banderhuizen, plantation houses, where spice cultivation could be controlled with precision. Local populations who had traditionally harvested nutmeg as part of a complex ecological knowledge system were replaced by enslaved laborers brought from other parts of the Indian Ocean world. The work was brutally extractive. Slaves were worked to exhaustion under tropical sun, then replaced when they expired. The Spice Islands became not just centers of commerce but vast labor camps, feeding the appetite for profit that flowed back to Amsterdam. And yet the violence was not random or chaotic. It was architected. The VOC maintained detailed records of every transaction, every punishment, every contract of indenture. Enslaved workers were listed on manifests just as carefully as cargo. There was an almost bureaucratic precision to the brutality, which in some ways made it more efficient and more systematic than simple plunder. Consider, too, the labor systems that developed across Java and Sumatra. The company established what it called the contingent system, a form of forced labor obligation, where indigenous peoples were required to produce specific quotas of spices or other goods for the VOC. If you lived under VOC control, a portion of your labor was not your own. It belonged to the company. Resistance resulted in punishment that ranged from fines to physical violence to expulsion and enslavement. The VOC did not think of itself as enslaving people in the traditional sense. It thought of itself as collecting obligations, extracting labor value, maximizing productive capacity. The language mattered because the language allowed the shareholders of Amsterdam to sleep at night. The spice prices that continued climbing in the European markets, the dividends that arrived like clockwork at the counting houses along the Herengracht Canal, these were built on this foundation of forced labor. Not entirely, perhaps, but fundamentally. The margins were as high as they were precisely because the company had externalized the human cost onto populations who had no say in the system and no legal recourse within it. There is a kind of historical distance that makes all of this easier to discuss dispassionately. We can examine the balance sheets and the demographic records and speak about the colonial labor system as though it were a feature of the landscape, rather than a deliberate choice made by merchants who understood perfectly well what they were doing. But the pain was not abstract. The people who died in the clove forests and the nutmeg plantations experienced their suffering moment by moment, not as a historical trend but as immediate, crushing reality. And here is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire system. It worked. The violence, the monopoly, the careful elimination of competition and of any alternative power structure in the Spice Islands. It generated such extraordinary wealth that the VOC's stock became the foundation of a new financial order. The shareholders grew richer, the company grew stronger. The system, however brutal in its periphery, proved spectacularly efficient in its core function, converting labor and natural resources into capital and dividends. One might ask whether the shareholders of Amsterdam actually understood what was happening in these distant islands, or whether the distance and the complexity of the supply chain simply allowed for a kind of convenient ignorance. The answer is likely both. Some company officers certainly understood the violence intimately. They directed it. But most shareholders, most of the widows and merchants and craftspeople who owned fragments of the VOC, likely knew only that their investment was producing returns that seemed almost miraculous. The actual mechanics were obscured by distance and by the nature of a shareholding system itself, which fragments responsibility and diffuses it across so many individual actors that no single person bears the weight of understanding what their ownership actually entails. This structure, this separation of ownership from consequence, this ability to profit from suffering that occurs beyond one's direct sight, would persist as one of the VOC's most significant legacies, even after the company itself had dissolved into history. And so the exchange itself began to breathe with a life of its own, transforming from a place where men simply bought and sold shares into something far more intricate, far more dreamlike in its complexity. Within decades of the bourse's opening, traders discovered they could do something almost magical with these pieces of paper. They could trade promises about the future as readily as they traded the shares themselves. Picture, if you will, a merchant standing in the crowded hall of the exchange on a grey Amsterdam morning. He does not own a single VOC share, yet he is nonetheless placing a wager on what that share might become. Perhaps he believes the next fleet returning from the Indies will be laden with spices so abundant that the value will rise. Or perhaps he fears the opposite, that storms or conflict or Portuguese interference might delay the ships and devastate prices. So he enters into an agreement, a contract, with another trader who holds the opposite view. This contract, this invisible agreement about a future that has not yet arrived, is what we might recognize today as an option or a futures contract. The genius of it, the almost unsettling brilliance, lay in the fact that these derivatives, as modern finance would later call them, cost far less than actually owning the underlying share. A man with limited capital could suddenly control a much larger position in the market. With a small payment, he could secure the right to buy or sell VOC shares at a price determined today, to be executed at a date in the future. He was trading in potential, in possibility, in the very substance of hope and fear. These instruments emerged quietly at first, almost casually, as traders simply began to formalize what had been informal handshake agreements into more binding contracts. The practice grew more elaborate over time, more systematic. Wealthy merchants and speculators began to understand that they could use these financial tools not merely to hedge their risk, that is, to protect themselves against loss, but to amplify their bets, to take positions far beyond what their actual wealth would allow. What had begun as a way for ordinary Amsterdam citizens to own a piece of global commerce was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a casino, though few called it by that name, or perhaps, more charitably, it was becoming a vast laboratory where human psychology was being tested against mathematical possibility. For the first time in recorded history, ordinary people with modest savings could lose vastly more than they had invested. The concept was dizzying, intoxicating to some, terrifying to others. The language of these early traders still survives in fragments, embedded in the financial vocabularies we use today. They spoke of termen, meaning a term or future date. They spoke of taking the bear side of a trade, betting that prices would fall, which gave the world the image of a bear swinging its paws downward. In contrast, the optimist who bet prices would rise became the bull, horns thrusting upward. These animal metaphors were not mere ornament. They reflected something primal in the human response to financial uncertainty. We are beasts of instinct, after all, and the market was merely another arena in which those instincts could play out. The most daring traders began to engage in what we now call short selling, perhaps the most counterintuitive of all financial activities. In essence, they would borrow VOC shares from someone who owned them, agree to return those same shares at a later date, and immediately sell them at the current price. They were betting that the price would fall before the return date arrived. If their prediction proved correct, they could buy back the shares at a lower price, pocket the difference, and return the shares to their lender. The profit was theirs. But if the price rose instead of fell, their losses could be catastrophic. They would have to purchase shares at ever higher prices, simply to fulfill their obligation to return them. This was a practice that would eventually generate considerable controversy and conflict, and we shall return to those tensions. But in these earlier decades, The mechanics of shorting were simply part of the evolving ecosystem of the exchange. Traders were learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that a financial market could be far more than a place to invest in actual voyages and cargo. It could become a realm where fortunes were won and lost based entirely on predictions, on the collective movements of human belief. The printing press, that great amplifier of information, played an essential role in making all of this possible. As we might pause to consider, how could a derivative market function without rapid dissemination of price information? Printers working in Amsterdam and other trading cities began to produce daily or weekly price lists, handwritten or printed, that moved from merchant to merchant, hand to hand. These price lists became objects of intense scrutiny, almost like oracles. A widow investing her modest dowry, a baker with surplus capital, a cloth merchant with seasonal profits. All of them would consult these lists with the intensity of pilgrims seeking divine truth. The information contained in those lists was the lifeblood of the market's new complexity. News from the Indies took months to arrive by ship, and in those months of silence, uncertainty reigned. Traders filled the vacuum with speculation, with gossip, with rumor and educated guessing. Did the latest fleet depart safely? Were the Portuguese mounting a new offensive? Had the monsoons been favorable? In the absence of confirmed facts, traders made wagers on their interpretations, their intuitions, their sheer luck. The market was not yet an efficient mechanism for discovering truth. It was, more often, a mirror of collective anxiety and hope. And yet, there is something almost restful in contemplating this early chaos, this beautiful confusion. The traders of Amsterdam, in inventing options and futures and short selling, were not thinking of themselves as engineers of a global financial system. They were simply responding to opportunity, to the possibility of profit, to the human desire to transform uncertainty into manageable units of risk. They were, in their way, like the early mariners who set out toward unknown horizons, not with grand philosophical purpose, but with the simple hunger to discover what lay beyond the visible edge of the world. Yet even as ordinary widows and bakers were discovering the gentle pleasure of watching their small shares grow with each season's dividend, there emerged among the merchant class a man whose appetite for profit took on a darker, more restless character. His name was Isaac Lemaire, and he would soon become the first person in recorded history to deliberately attempt the manipulation of a stock market, discovering in the process both the tremendous power and the rigid limits of collective human suspicion. Lemaire came from wealth and connection. He had been involved in the earliest trading companies before the VOC's great unification, and he possessed the knowledge that comes only from years spent reading the waves of commerce, understanding how prices moved not always by the gentle hand of supply and demand, but by the trembling hand of human emotion and rumor. What began as curiosity evolved into something closer to an obsession. He asked himself a question that had perhaps never been asked so clearly before. What if one could profit not from the rise of a price, but from its fall? The mechanics of this idea were exquisite in their simplicity, though breathtaking in their audacity. If you could somehow borrow shares of the VOC, shares you did not own, and then sell them at today's high price, you could later buy them back at a lower price, keep the difference, and return the borrowed shares to their owner. The market would have to cooperate, of course. The price would have to fall. But if you were patient, if you were clever, if you could whisper the right words into the right ears, perhaps you could help coax that fall into being. Between 1609 and 1610, Lemaire began his enterprise. The exact methods remained somewhat obscured by the fog of early financial record-keeping, but contemporary accounts suggest he worked in concert with other merchants who shared both his ambitions and his access to capital. They borrowed shares from the VOC's various holders, people who trusted the company's long-term prospects and were willing to lend their certificates for a small fee. Lemaire and his associates then flooded the market with these borrowed shares, pressing the price downward through sheer volume of supply. Simultaneously, they began spreading rumors. The whispers started in the taverns near the Bourse, in the coffee houses where merchants gathered, in the private correspondence between trading houses, rumors of shipwrecks in distant seas, rumors of failed voyages and lost cargoes, rumors that the company's voyages to the Indies were far more dangerous than anyone admitted, that ships were disappearing into the depths, that the routes were not as profitable as the optimistic estimates had suggested. How curious it must have been to watch a crowd slowly begin to believe what it whispered to itself. Prices that had seemed so stable, so promising, began to waver. Uncertainty rippled through the marketplace. Some shareholders grew anxious and sold their holdings at lower prices, hoping to protect themselves from further decline. The very act of their selling pushed prices down further, a downward spiral that fed on its own momentum. For a brief window, it seemed Lemaire's audacious scheme might succeed. He had borrowed high, sold high, and now watched as prices descended toward the level where he could buy back the shares at a tremendous profit. But human communities, even in their early experiments with markets, contain within them a kind of immune response to obvious predation. As prices fell with unnatural speed, and as the rumors began to seem too convenient, too perfectly timed to the sudden flood of shares, suspicion began to crystallize into something harder than mere doubt. Merchants and investors started asking each other, who benefits from this panic? Who has been selling? The Amsterdam Bourse, young though it was, had developed watchers and chroniclers. Price movements were being recorded. Patterns were becoming visible. The backlash, when it came, was swift and unforgiving. City authorities, concerned that their new market, this precious innovation that was already attracting merchants and capital from across Europe, might be corrupted or destroyed by such blatant manipulation, took action. Lemaire and his conspirators were identified, investigated, and ultimately prosecuted. The exact punishments remain somewhat veiled in the historical record, though it appears he faced both financial penalties and public censure. More significantly, he was banned from trading in VOC shares. The market's first great predator had been caught and expelled. What is striking about this episode, and what marks it as a genuine turning point in the psychology of markets, is not that manipulation was attempted, such human ambitions are perhaps eternal, but that it failed. The failure came not from the inherent impossibility of manipulation, but from something deeper and more interesting, the simple arithmetic of collective attention. When enough people are watching, when prices are being recorded and compared, when rumors can be traced to their source and questioned against visible facts, the manipulator loses his advantage. The market is not wise in any mystical sense, but it is attentive, and attention, sustained and shared across many minds, acts as a kind of guardian. Lemaire's scheme also revealed something else that would reshape financial life for centuries to come. The mechanism he had pioneered, borrowing shares to sell them in hopes of buying them back lower, was not going away. Instead, it would be acknowledged, formalized, and eventually regulated. Short selling, as it came to be called, became a permanent feature of the Amsterdam exchange. Some critics wanted it banned entirely. Others recognized that the ability to profit from a falling price actually deepened the market, making it harder to manipulate because both rising and falling prices now attracted speculators with an interest in accuracy. The merchants of Amsterdam, having witnessed this first great test of their new institution, drew certain conclusions. They reinforced rules around reporting. They clarified which shares could legally be borrowed and under what conditions. They created procedures for verifying trades. They were, in their way, writing the earliest chapters of market regulation, learning through trial and error how to protect a community's financial commons from those who would exploit it for personal gain. And in doing so, they were laying the foundations for something that would outlast the VOC itself, enduring into our present age, the stock market, as a place where both truth and lies circulate, where vigilance is required, where the crowd's collective attention serves as its deepest defense. To understand what the VOC truly was, you must picture the ships, not as they appear in paintings, those Golden Age canvases hung in Amsterdam museums, but as they existed in the minds of the merchants who financed them and the sailors who lived aboard them for months without seeing land. The vessels themselves were a careful compromise between conflicting desires. They needed to be sturdy enough to survive the Atlantic swells and the unpredictable temperament of waters no Dutch ship had fully mastered, yet capacious enough to carry cargo that would justify the astronomical costs of the voyage. The result was the Fluit, a design that emerged from Dutch shipyards in the preceding decades and became the backbone of VOC commerce. The Fluit was not the fastest ship. It was not the most maneuverable. What it was, instead, was efficient. A vessel engineered with a merchant's eye, with a high cargo-to-crew ratio that meant fewer mouths to feed on the journey and more space for the substances that would become the lifeblood of European desire. The hull was broad and round, built to settle low in the water when laden with goods, and the superstructure was smaller than contemporary warships, creating a shape that somehow managed to be both ungainly and purposeful. These ships cost enormous sums to build, often financed by consortiums of small investors who would never see the vessel in person, trusting entirely in the reputation of the shipwright and the promise written in the VOC's ledgers. What did these ships carry across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean? The answer is both simpler and more complex than one might imagine. The Fluit, departing from Amsterdam in the early 1600s, would first sail to Africa, to the Cape of Good Hope, and along the way, traders would accumulate what might be termed the ballast of early modernity: copper, cloth, wine, wool, tin, and pewter. These goods had value in Asia, certainly, but they were not the treasures Europe truly craved. Those treasures waited on the other side of the voyage, in the holds of the return ships that would eventually fight their way back across the same waters. The journey itself was an ordeal that has perhaps been domesticated by distance and time. 8 to 10 months of sailing, sometimes longer. The vessel would be crowded with crew, often 60 or more men on a Fluit, sleeping in shifts, their hammocks slung so tightly together that you could barely turn. The air below deck became thick with the exhaled breath of scores of men, with the smell of bilge water that seeped perpetually into the lowest chambers, with the scent of preserved food stored in casks, dried peas, hardtack that could survive the voyage without crumbling entirely, barrels of salt beef that sailors came to regard with something between appetite and revulsion. The voyage posed dangers that were not merely abstract or theoretical. Scurvy claimed lives with a quiet inevitability, a disease that emerged slowly from vitamin deficiency, beginning with swollen gums and loose teeth, progressing toward a kind of physical dissolution that sailors experienced as both agonizing and somehow unreal. The company came gradually, very gradually, to understand that citrus could prevent the affliction, though this knowledge was absorbed unevenly and often too late. There were also storms of a violence that is difficult to convey in calm language, seas that would rise 20 or 30 feet in the space of moments, winds that could snap the masts or tear the canvas to shreds. Men were swept overboard, ships were lost entirely, vanishing with all souls aboard, their fate unknown until a ship arriving in Batavia failed to provide any news, and relatives in Amsterdam began the slow work of grieving without certainty. Yet still the ships departed, still men signed on, still investors committed capital that was largely irrecoverable should the voyage fail. Why? Because the profit mathematics, when successful, were genuinely extraordinary. A ship that sailed to the Indonesian archipelago and returned laden with nutmeg, cloves, mace, and pepper, would sell that cargo for prices that could represent a return of hundreds of % on the initial investment. A single voyage could alter the financial circumstance of a merchant family. A single voyage could transform capital into something approaching wealth. The return cargo was where the true alchemy occurred. The Molucca Islands, the Spice Islands, as they were called in hushed tones throughout European merchant houses, produced spices that were among the most valuable substances known to the commercial world. Nutmeg and mace, which grew only on the island of Banda, were worth their weight in silver in many European markets. The clove trees of Ternate and Tidore were guarded as fiercely as gemstone mines. These spices were not luxuries in the way that jewelry or fine art might be luxuries. They were medicines, preservatives, flavor enhancers, at a time when European winters were long and the food stored to sustain populations through them was monotonous and vulnerable to rot. The voyage to acquire these spices would see the fluid anchoring in the Sunda Strait, navigating through waters that required careful knowledge and fortunate weather. The captain and merchants would establish trading posts or negotiate with local rulers, exchanging the European goods they had carried, along with silver coins, for currency was often the truest medium of exchange for the precious spices. The loading of the return cargo required careful attention. Too much weight and the ship sat dangerously low in the water. Too little and the voyage returned insufficient value to justify the risk taken. The decision was always a calculation performed against uncertainty. And then the ship would turn around. The return voyage was, in some ways, even more perilous than the outbound journey. The crew would be worn down by months at sea. The vessel, now heavily laden, moved more sluggishly through the water. The waters around the Cape of Good Hope were notoriously treacherous, with currents and storms that had earned the region names like the Cape of Storms before someone rebranded it more hopefully. Ships traveling this route would sometimes take additional months to round the Cape, fighting wind and wave with a patience that seems almost inconceivable to modern sensibilities. For those who survived, who arrived back in Amsterdam with the hold still full of spices, there awaited a strange moment of reckoning. The spices would be unloaded into the company's warehouses. They would be sorted and graded, and then, in a process that was managed with considerable care, they would be released into the market in quantities that kept prices elevated without triggering a glut that would collapse profit margins. Here was another innovation, another way in which the VOC demonstrated a form of economic sophistication that preceded conventional economic theory by a century, the understanding that controlling supply could manipulate demand and profit simultaneously. The company would keep vast quantities of spices in storage, restricting flow to market, accepting lower physical sales to maintain higher prices. A warehouse became, in effect, a mechanism for wealth creation. But to tell only the success stories would be to obscure something essential about these voyages. For every ship that returned, others did not. For every merchant family enriched by a successful voyage, others waited months and then years, gradually accepting that the vessel they had financed would not return. The financial records of the VOC speak of this in their careful, methodical way. Losses from shipwreck, losses from piracy, losses from disease and accident. Even in the early decades, when the VOC was young and its monopoly still contested, the total value of ships lost could represent significant drains on overall profitability. The investors accepted this as the cost of engagement with such distant, such perilous commerce, and still they invested. The ships themselves became objects of fascination and aspiration. Seeing a fluid under full sail, riding low in the water with its cargo, became a kind of promise written in wood and canvas, a promise that connection to distant places was possible, that commerce could span oceans, that wealth could be transported from one world to another. The harbour at Amsterdam would fill with these vessels, a forest of masts that grew denser with each passing decade. And looking at that harbour, watching ships depart and arrive, watching the rhythms of commerce establish themselves, you might sense that you were witnessing something genuinely new in human history. The infrastructure of a global economy in its earliest, most tentative manifestation. By the early 1700s, the United East India Company had become something the world had never quite seen before. A corporation with the power of empires, a merchant vessel with the weapons of nations. In the ports of Amsterdam and Jakarta, in the creaking holds of ships bound for distant islands, in the careful ledgers kept by company accountants, the VOC had accumulated not merely wealth, but sovereignty itself. What began as a trading monopoly had quietly transformed into something far more extraordinary, a state unto itself, answering to no king save the shareholders who held its shares. The company maintained its own navy, of course. This was necessary, they would say, to protect their trade routes from pirates and rival European powers. Yet this navy, this magnificent fleet of merchant vessels and warships, numbered in the hundreds. Some of these ships carried nothing but soldiers and cannons. The VOC could muster an armed force that rivaled the military strength of several European kingdoms. On the waters of the Indian Ocean and the seas surrounding the Indonesian archipelago, no power could challenge them. The company's flag, a merchant's ensign marked with the initials of the company in intertwined letters, was more feared in those waters than the flags of Portugal or Spain or England. When a foreign ship appeared on the horizon, captains would ask not, "Is that a Portuguese galleon?" but rather, "Is that the VOC?" The answer determined whether they would live or surrender their cargo. More extraordinary still was the company's authority to mint its own coins. In the ports where the VOC held dominion, you could spend currency stamped not with the face of a prince or a king, but with the company's own seal. This was not mere convenience. It was a declaration of power. Money, after all, is perhaps the most fundamental expression of sovereignty. To mint coins is to say, "I am the authority here. I determine value. I am the source of order." In Batavia, the great colonial capital that the company had founded on the island of Java, the company's currency circulated freely, backed not by the promise of a nation, but by the promise of trade itself. Merchants understood that the company would honor its own coins because the company needed those coins to function. It was a circular form of trust, and it worked with elegant efficiency. The company's reach extended far beyond commerce. In the sprawling territories it controlled across the Indonesian archipelago, the Moluccas with their precious cloves, the islands where nutmeg and mace grew, the ports where spices were gathered and processed and prepared for the long voyage home, the VOC was not merely a trading partner. It was the law, it was the judge, it was the administrator. The company appointed governors, it collected taxes, it built fortresses, it negotiated treaties with local rulers, and when those rulers proved difficult to negotiate with, the company simply replaced them. The relationship between the company and the territories it controlled was one that blurred entirely the line between commerce and colonialism. Can we call it commerce when one party has monopoly power over force? Can we call it trade when it is negotiated at the point of a sword? Consider the treaties themselves, those carefully worded documents that historians find in archives across Europe and Asia. The VOC negotiated these agreements as if it were a sovereign state, with the rulers of Java, with the sultans of the Moluccas, with the kingdoms of Sumatra. The company's representatives would sit across tables and work out the terms of exclusivity, of tribute, of territory. These were not the negotiations of merchants haggling over price. These were the negotiations of powers delimiting spheres of influence. The company promised military protection, and in exchange, it demanded that local rulers trade exclusively with the VOC. It demanded access to their ports. It demanded preferential treatment in the purchase of spices, and it demanded that rival European powers be excluded entirely. When local rulers resisted these terms, the company responded with force. Fortresses were built, fleets were dispatched, entire regions were brought under VOC control, not because the company had purchased them or negotiated for them in good faith, but because the company simply possessed the military capability to take them. The company's headquarters in Batavia had grown into something resembling a capital city, though perhaps one might more accurately describe it as a fortress surrounded by the infrastructure of trade. The Governor-General, who administered the company's Asian dominions, held a position of such authority that he rivaled many European kings in the scope of his power. He commanded the armies. He negotiated the treaties. He collected the tributes. He minted the coins. He determined policy across islands that stretched across distances greater than much of Europe. And yet, he answered to the shareholders in Amsterdam. It was a remarkable structure, authority flowing outward from a merchant republic through the Asian seas, each layer of command ultimately derived from the principle that the company existed to generate profits for those who had invested their money in it. What is perhaps most striking about this arrangement is how easily and naturally it seemed to emerge. There was no grand plan, no conspiracy of merchant princes who sat down and decided to create a corporate state. Instead, the company simply grew into the power vacuum that existed in the Indian Ocean. As its profits increased, as its fleet grew larger, as more shareholders invested more capital, the company found itself in a position to exercise control. And when you have the ability to control territory and people, when you have the means to mint coins and negotiate treaties, you tend to exercise that ability. The company was not unique in this regard. Empires have always conquered territories and extracted resources, but the company was unique in that it did so as a capitalist enterprise, accountable to shareholders rather than to divine right or historical claim. The company's peak, then, was not merely a moment of commercial success. It was a moment when the boundaries between commerce and state power had become so thoroughly blurred that the distinction seemed almost quaint. The VOC was simultaneously a merchant company seeking profits and an imperial power controlling territories. It was simultaneously answerable to shareholders and wielding the authority of a sovereign state. This dual nature, part business, part government, would echo forward through the centuries, shaping the way that European powers approached colonialism and, in some measure, shaping the modern corporation itself. And yet, for all the machinery of the bourse and the careful ledgers of the company, there lived within that first generation of shareholders a sensation entirely new to human experience. They were navigating something unprecedented. No market existed before this one. No framework of language quite captured what it meant to own a piece of something so distant, so vital, yet so utterly beyond one's direct control, or even full comprehension. A widow in Amsterdam, perhaps, had placed her modest inheritance into shares at the very moment the charter was signed in 1602. She could hold the paper, the certificate itself, with its official seal and handwritten promise of ownership. She could sell it if she needed coin. But could she truly know what her capital had become across the span of the Indian Ocean? Could anyone? There is something profoundly human in that uncertainty. The earliest shareholders of the VOC were, in essence, gambling with logic and documentation. They made calculations, yes. They studied the accounts released periodically by the company. They understood in theory what a dividend was, a share of profits returned to those who had risked their capital. Yet the waiting was immense. A voyage to the Indies and back consumed years. The ships sailed out laden with silver and European goods. And if all proceeded as planned, if storms did not shatter the hulls, if disease did not claim the crews, if pirates and rival traders did not intercept the convoy, then, years hence, the holds would return heavy with cloves and nutmeg and pepper. And from those sails, After the company's vast expenses were deducted, some portion would be distributed among the shareholders. In the earliest decades, those dividends were staggering. A man or woman who had invested a modest sum at the company's founding might receive returns of 20, sometimes even 30% per year. The wealth generated was real and immediate enough that it reshaped Amsterdam's very face. Merchants built grander houses. Widows could sustain themselves. Small investors saw their fortunes turn unexpected. Yet this abundance masked something more fragile and troubling beneath its surface. Each dividend was not truly a return of profit in any pure sense. It was, more often than not, a distribution of the company's capital itself, a gentle drawing down from the enormous initial investment. The actual voyages, the actual trading, the actual wars being fought for control of the Moluccas, these enterprises consumed money far faster than they generated it in those early years. The company was sustained partly by myth, partly by arrival of unexpected fleets laden with exceptional cargoes, and partly by a careful manipulation of expectation. But the shareholders did not see it this way, or perhaps they chose not to see it. What they experienced was something more immediate and visceral, the feeling of ownership without responsibility, of gain without direct labor, of wealth flowing from across the world into their hands through nothing but a document and a signature. It was seductive. It rewrote the relationship between risk and reward. For those early investors were acutely aware of the risk, even if they did not possess a mathematical language for it. Every ship that departed Amsterdam was vulnerable. Severe storms in the Atlantic could kill hundreds in a matter of hours. The Cape of Good Hope was notorious for its violence. Ships spoke of waves so immense they seemed to swallow the sky itself. And once you reached the Indies, the dangers multiplied. Malaria and dysentery claimed more sailors than combat ever did. Some estimates suggest that of every 10 men who departed Amsterdam for the Indies, perhaps 2 or 3 would return alive. The shareholders understood this. They heard the stories. They saw the widows and orphans left behind by the lost crews. And yet they invested nonetheless. What psychological architecture permitted this? Partly it was the distance. Amsterdam felt safe and stable. The Indies were impossibly far away, almost abstract in their remoteness. A merchant's wife reading a pamphlet about the company's activities could register the information intellectually while keeping it at arm's length emotionally. The risk did not feel present in the way that standing on a ship's deck would make it present. The danger belonged to sailors and soldiers, not to the capital itself, yet the profits felt entirely real. They arrived in ships. They could be counted and held and spent. There is also something quieter to observe here, something about the nature of investment psychology itself, that the VOC shareholders were among the first to demonstrate at scale. They were experiencing what we might now recognize as a form of cognitive separation between the abstract promise represented by a share and the actual reality of the commercial enterprise. The share was liquid. It could be bought, sold, transferred. It existed in a marketplace where price fluctuated based on news and rumor and the collective sentiment of other investors. But the enterprise itself, the company's fleets, its forts, its wars, its monopolies, operated in a completely different temporal and geographical register. A shareholder in Amsterdam could profit or lose based entirely on market sentiment, on whether rumors suggested the next fleet would return laden with exceptional cargo, or whether whispers of piracy or storm damage had circulated through the coffee houses and the street outside the bourse. The share price might rise or fall with no direct correlation to the company's actual circumstances. This too was entirely new. As we reflect more softly on this phenomenon, we might wonder what it meant psychologically to be among the first humans to experience this particular kind of wealth. For most of history, property was tangible. A man could see his land, touch his goods, understand with his own eyes what he possessed. A merchant could tour his warehouse. A farmer could walk his fields. But shares in the VOC represented something almost ethereal, a claim on a distant future, validated by a piece of paper and the reputation of institutions that most shareholders would never fully understand. Yet this very abstraction, this distance from direct knowledge, created a peculiar kind of hope. As long as you did not think too carefully about what was happening in Java, you could maintain an optimistic picture. And there is a strange intimacy in the bourse itself that deserves acknowledgement. The Amsterdam bourse was not a grand and imposing structure, not in those early decades. It was a modest colonnaded building, and what gave it life was the human gathering. Investors would arrive at specific hours, would congregate in small clusters, would speak in hushed tones or occasionally raised voices about the news from the Indies, about which ships were overdue, about which trading routes seemed most promising. Widows and bakers and wealthy merchants stood shoulder to shoulder in this marketplace. They negotiated directly with one another. They made small talk about the risks and opportunities. They formed a kind of community around this shared faith in the distant enterprise. In a sense, they were validating one another's courage in investing. The presence of others doing the same thing provided a kind of collective reassurance. This phenomenon, the power of seeing others invest, of participating in a shared market where prices are set by collective agreement, would eventually be recognized as one of the great discoveries of the VOC era. It made risk feel more manageable, more bearable, because it was distributed and socialized. You were not alone in your uncertainty. Hundreds or thousands of others were experiencing the same exposure, the same waiting, the same hope. And as long as the dividends continued to arrive, as long as the company maintained its mystique and its monopoly, there was little reason to look too closely at the underlying mechanics. What the VOC shareholders were experiencing, without necessarily having language for it, was perhaps the first large-scale exercise in market psychology, in the power of information asymmetry, in the seductive potential of passive wealth generation. They were pioneers in a very particular sense, not explorers discovering new lands, but discoverers of a new relationship to capital itself, a new way of imagining profit and risk in the modern world. Yet by the middle years of the 1700s, something subtle began to shift in the corridors and counting houses of Amsterdam. The VOC, that magnificent engine of commerce and control, which had seemed as permanent as the Dutch coastline itself, had begun to show the first quiet signs of fatigue. Not collapse, not sudden ruin, but a slow, almost imperceptible weakening, like a piece of old timber that holds its shape long after the rot has begun its patient work beneath the surface. The early decades of the century had still held glory. The dividends flowed. The ships arrived laden with spices, silks, and porcelain. Yet the costs of maintaining that empire had grown in ways that even the most astute merchant could scarcely have anticipated. To hold Java, the Moluccas, and the string of trading posts that stretched from the African coast to the distant shores of Japan required not merely merchant vessels and commercial acumen, it required soldiers, fortifications, wars, endless, grinding wars against rival European powers, against local sultans and princes who had begun to resist the company's strangling monopolies, against the simple entropy of maintaining order across an empire that spanned nearly half the globe. The 7 Years' War of the 1750s and 60s had proven particularly ruinous. While the VOC remained officially neutral, the conflict that raged across Europe and Asia drained its resources in subtle and catastrophic ways. British privateers harried its shipping lanes. French fleets challenged its dominance in the Indian Ocean. The costs of defending its trading posts, of replacing lost vessels, of paying for troops and ammunition spiraled upward, while the profits themselves began, almost imperceptibly at first, to flatten. Shareholders, who had grown accustomed to expecting returns of 15, sometimes 20%, now found themselves receiving dividends of 8 or 9%. Then 5. Corruption had also woven itself into the fabric of the company's operations with a quiet persistence that was difficult to root out. In Amsterdam, the directors and the bewindhebberen, the managing partners who held the strings of power, had grown comfortable with their position. Some of them had begun to use their access to company information for private gain. They knew which ships would arrive when, what the market would bear for pepper and cloves weeks before common merchants could know. The barriers between the company's interests and their own personal enrichment had begun to blur. It is perhaps inevitable, one might gently suggest, that when vast power accumulates in human hands, the distinction between public good and private advantage grows ever more difficult to perceive. The administrative apparatus itself had also become bloated and sluggish. Where once the VOC had operated with relative speed and decisiveness, making decisions in Amsterdam that would ripple across the Asian seas within months, it had now developed the slow, creaking inertia of a bureaucracy that had grown too large to move with agility. Decisions were delayed. Communications took months or years. Opportunities were missed. The nimble British East India Company, by contrast, had begun to operate with greater flexibility, adapting more quickly to changing markets and making decisions closer to where the actual commerce was happening. The Dutchmen found themselves increasingly outmaneuvered by a rival that had learned to combine the benefits of centralized capital with distributed decision-making. And there was another shift occurring in the world of global trade itself, one that would have been difficult for any merchant in Amsterdam to fully comprehend in the moment. The spice trade, that great monopoly upon which the entire VOC edifice had been built, was beginning very slowly to lose its exclusive grip on European commerce and imagination. New trade routes were opening. New products were entering the market. Coffee, which had become fashionable in Europe, was no longer the jealously guarded secret of Ottoman and Arab traders. Tea, which had once been precious beyond measure, was being cultivated in new regions. The wealth that had once flowed inexorably toward Dutch merchants was beginning to spread and disperse in directions that no single company, no matter how powerful, could easily control. The Indian Ocean itself was becoming a more contested space. European powers multiplied their efforts at territorial acquisition and commercial dominance. The French established themselves in India and the Indian Ocean Islands. The British, with their characteristic patience and methodical approach to colonialism, were building a presence that would eventually exceed even the VOC's reach. The Portuguese, that ancient rival against whom the VOC had originally defined itself, had faded but not disappeared. And within Asia, the local rulers and merchants who had once been utterly dependent on European trade had begun to develop their own networks, their own alternatives, their own leverage against the monopolistic practices that had previously constrained them so absolutely. By the 1770s and 80s, the cracks had become visible even to casual observers. The ships still sailed, the spices still arrived, yet the great golden age had definitively passed. Where did it go, this extraordinary period of dominance? Not into a sudden abyss, but into the slow accumulation of small failures, missed opportunities, mounting debts, and the persistent human tendency toward complacency when success has lasted long enough to feel permanent. The wars with Britain had been particularly expensive. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, from 1780 to 1784, had been almost catastrophic. The British seized Dutch ships. They attacked the company's possessions. The Dutch had suffered grievous losses at sea, and defending their territories had consumed resources at a rate that simply could not be sustained. When peace finally came, the company's treasury was depleted. Its fleet had been damaged. Its monopolies were weaker than they had been in living memory. The great trading monopoly that had once seemed immortal was now merely wealthy and wounded. What must it have felt like, one might wonder, for a shareholder in Amsterdam to watch the dividends decline, for a widow who had entrusted a modest inheritance to VOC shares to realize that the income she had depended upon was slowly shrinking, for the merchants and traders who had built their fortunes on the assumption that the company's dominance was eternal, to grasp that the world was changing in ways they could not control or even fully understand. The market, that revolutionary invention that the VOC itself had created on the Amsterdam bourse, was now beginning to price in the reality of decline. The institutional memory of the company's earlier ventures and victories seemed somehow to fade as the century wore on. The driving ambition that had animated the founding directors, that hunger to challenge Portuguese dominance and to build something unprecedented, had mellowed into an orientation toward preservation rather than growth. The company was still profitable, still powerful, still commanded respect and generated wealth. Yet the trajectory was no longer ascending. It had plateaued. And in a world where other powers were rising, where opportunities were expanding elsewhere, a plateau is another word for slow decline. By the closing decades of the 18th century, the great company that had once seemed immortal, that had built nations within nations, minted its own coins, commanded naval fleets that made emperors negotiate, had begun its long, almost imperceptible fade. The VOC's decline was not sudden, not dramatic with a single moment of collapse. Instead, it was the slow erosion of an aging colossus, worn down by the very success it had once enjoyed. The monopoly that had enriched merchants and widows alike for nearly 2 centuries had become, paradoxically, its own impediment. Competitors had learned to navigate around the VOC's grip. The British East India Company, once smaller and less organized, had grown into a rival force of equal or greater cunning. The French had their own Eastern interests, and the world itself had changed in ways that the rigid structures of the VOC could no longer accommodate. The company's financial troubles deepened as the 17th century became the 18th. Wars in Europe drained the Dutch treasury, and the VOC, which had once operated with the confidence of an independent state, found itself increasingly entangled in the debts of the nation it technically served. Corruption within the trading posts of the Indies, the long and expensive maintenance of Batavia, and the sprawling fortresses across the Spice Islands, the sheer cost of keeping a private army supplied and loyal across such vast distances, all of this accumulated like barnacles on a ship's hull, slowing its progress through the water. Dividends that had once flowed reliably to shareholders began to shrink. Where the earliest investors had watched their small investments transform into considerable wealth, later generations saw their returns diminish, irregular, sometimes absent entirely. The psychology of investing, you might reflect, often depends on the direction of the arrow. Do returns promise growth, or do they whisper decline? By 1750, the situation had become serious enough that the company required a loan from the Dutch government just to sustain its operations. Can you imagine such a reversal? The institution that had once been the engine of the nation's wealth, the source of seemingly endless profit, was now dependent on state support. The company reduced its dividend, then reduced it again. The share price, which had climbed so high in the earliest years of the bourse, began to fluctuate unpredictably. Some shareholders held on in hope, others sold their positions at losses and looked elsewhere. The sense of inexhaustibility that had once surrounded the VOC, the feeling that it represented an entirely new and permanent mechanism for the generation of wealth, was slowly, quietly evaporating. The Napoleonic Wars that swept through Europe at the turn of the 19th century delivered the final blows. When Napoleon's forces occupied the Dutch Republic in 1795, the VOC's monopoly over Eastern trade was shattered entirely. The Dutch Navy, which had protected the company's interests for generations, was defeated. The fortresses and settlements that the company had defended at such great cost were vulnerable. When the French revolutionary government looked at the books of the VOC, this ancient behemoth of commerce. It saw not a proud institution, but a financial liability, a relic of an older world, bloated with corruption and unable to adapt. The company's debts had grown so large, its infrastructure so expensive to maintain, that its dissolution seemed not a tragedy but a mercy, a release from an unsustainable burden. On December 20th, 1799, the United East India Company was formally dissolved. It was not a day of dramatic ceremonies or public mourning, at least not on the scale one might imagine for an institution that had shaped 2 centuries of global history. The charter expired quietly. The company's remaining assets, its ships and warehouses and trading posts and claims on territories, were absorbed into the Dutch state. Shareholders received compensation based on what remained after debts were settled, not the fortunes they might have hoped for in the company's glory days, but something. The transformation was bureaucratic, almost mundane in its procedures. The VOC became property of the Netherlands, and the Netherlands distributed and administered what the company had built. Yet in the dissolution itself, something curious and profound occurred. The VOC did not disappear, it was absorbed. The structures the company had created, the administrative systems, the fortified settlements, the trade networks stretching across the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific, did not vanish. Instead, they were inherited. The Dutch state took over governance of the East Indies, reorganizing them as the Dutch East Indies, a colonial possession that would remain under Dutch control for another century and a half. Batavia became the capital of a colonial state rather than a company outpost, but Batavia continued to exist, continued to function as a hub of trade and administration. The forts remained. The trading routes, slightly altered by new political circumstances, remained. The people living under Dutch rule in the Indies, the indigenous populations, the mixed-race communities, the merchants and administrators, experienced the shift from VOC rule to direct colonial rule more as a change in bureaucratic procedure than as a genuine transformation. What is worth reflecting upon in the quiet hours when sleep draws near is how institutions transform. The VOC had been structured as a corporation, an entity that existed separately from the Dutch state, even while serving it. When it dissolved, that distinction collapsed. The corporation became the state's direct possession. And in this transition, the innovations that the VOC had pioneered, the mechanisms of joint stock ownership, the bourse where shares were traded, the very concept of a commercial entity that could raise capital from ordinary citizens and distribute profits among them, these innovations were not lost. They had already escaped into the world. They had been copied, refined, improved upon by competitors and observers in Britain, France, elsewhere. The dissolution of the VOC meant the end of one company, but not the end of the form of organization it had invented. If anything, the company's decline and disappearance freed its structural innovations to spread more widely, no longer trapped within the cage of a single monopoly. The British East India Company, which had learned from observing the VOC, continued to grow and would eventually command even greater power than its Dutch predecessor. Colonial ventures by other European nations increasingly adopted similar structures, chartered companies with limited liability, with shares that could be traded, with the ability to raise capital from the investing public. The mechanism had proven its worth, proven that ordinary people could become shareholders in enterprises that spanned continents, that wealth could be created through the organization of commerce and the refinement of trading networks. The VOC's specific monopoly over the spice trade had ended, but its method had become the template for the global economic system that was beginning to emerge. In the Indies themselves, the transition from company rule to state rule was complex and gradual. Some of the VOC's practices continued virtually unchanged. The monopolies on certain valuable products, on opium, on salt, were preserved by the colonial state. The forced labor systems, the requirements imposed on indigenous populations to grow and harvest goods for export, these too persisted under new management. The human costs of that system, the suffering that had been masked by the profit calculations of shareholders in Amsterdam, continued in different forms under different administrators. The dissolution of the company did not bring an end to exploitation or suffering. It merely transferred the responsibility from a commercial entity to a state apparatus. When the VOC finally dissolved in 1799, its shareholders received their final dividends, and the ships were sold or scuttled, yet something far more lasting remained, a blueprint so elegant and so functional that it would become the invisible architecture of how human beings organize capital and risk across the entire modern world. The question that had animated those early Amsterdam merchants, how do you gather the resources of many people to undertake something too large for one person to bear? That question never stopped being asked. It only became more insistent, more ambitious, more woven into the fabric of daily economic life. Consider the structure that emerged from those humid harbour offices in Amsterdam around 1602, the idea that a company could be owned by many people who held fractional shares, that those shares could be bought and sold freely in a marketplace, that the value of those shares would fluctuate based on profit expectations and news and whispered rumours. This became not peculiar but foundational. When the first modern corporations began to emerge across Europe and then America in the 18th and 19th centuries, they did not invent ownership from whole cloth. They looked back, whether consciously or by cultural osmosis, to what the Dutch had done, and they copied it. The East India Company that England chartered was modelled directly on the VOC's structure. The great trading companies that would later birth themselves into industrial empires, textiles, railroads, manufacturing, all carried forward that genetic code of dispersed ownership and tradable shares. What's striking, and perhaps worth sitting with for a moment, is how the vocabulary itself persisted. We still speak of shareholders, of equity, of dividends, of stock. The modern stock market in every major city on Earth, London, New York, Tokyo, Singapore, these are lineal descendants of the Amsterdam Bourse. The trading floor, the market price, the public quotation of values minute by minute. These practices were born in Amsterdam and nowhere else on the planet before. When you walk into a trading room today or pull up a stock quote on your phone, you are participating in an institution whose foundational logic and language dates back 400 years to a small company trying to organize the pepper trade. The printing press, that ancient technology by the time of the VOC's later years, had enabled something crucial that modern markets still depend upon: the rapid dissemination of price information and company news. Those broadsheets and pamphlets that advertised VOC share prices in the 1600s were the ancestors of financial newspapers, of the Reuters and Associated Press wires, of Bloomberg terminals, of the real-time price feeds that stream across screens in millions of offices. Information traveling faster than it once did has always been the secret to how markets function. The VOC understood this intuitively. They printed, they posted, they made known. And ever since, the health of a market has been tethered to how freely and quickly information can flow. There is something almost hypnotic about tracing how a specific innovation travels through time, mutating, improving, yet remaining recognizable. The options and futures that Isaac Lemaire and his contemporaries traded in Amsterdam, elaborate bets on future prices, leveraged positions that allowed a person to control more value than they possessed. These instruments seemed to vanish when the VOC declined, yet they re-emerged centuries later in Chicago commodity pits and on modern derivatives exchanges. Someone in the 1800s or 1900s, wrestling with the problem of how to hedge agricultural risk or speculate on prices, arrived at solutions that were astonishingly similar to what had been done in the early 1600s. Did they inherit the idea directly, or did they reinvent it? Perhaps the line between invention and discovery blurs when you're solving the same fundamental human problems: how to transfer risk, how to bet on the future, how to make money from uncertainty itself. The concept of limited liability, too, that revolutionary aspect of the VOC's structure, where an investor's losses could not exceed the capital they had invested. This principle seemed so novel and necessary that it became encoded into law. Today, when you hear that a corporation has limited liability, that shareholders cannot be sued for the debts of the company beyond their shares, you are hearing an echo of that early Dutch insight that ownership and obligation needed boundaries, that risk needed to be quantified and contained. Without this principle, the modern stock market as it exists would be unimaginable. People would never invest their savings in a corporation if they stood to lose everything they owned. Limited liability made mass investing possible. The Dutch made it possible. Yet there is a shadow side to this inheritance that deserves gentle acknowledgement. The shareholder model that flowered from the VOC's structure created, for the first time in history, a system where the profits of a venture could be separated entirely from the moral or human consequences of that venture. An investor in Amsterdam could profit from atrocities in Java without ever witnessing them, without feeling their weight. This separation of consequence from reward, of profit from responsibility, this became a permanent feature of the capitalist corporation. A modern shareholder can own a piece of a company whose labor practices are brutal, whose environmental impact is devastating, and feel financially entitled to those dividends regardless. Whether this is inevitable or merely historical accident remains debated, but it is undeniably part of the legacy. The rise of institutional investing, where pension funds and insurance companies and investment trusts manage vast pools of money on behalf of ordinary people. This too traces back to the VOC era. The idea that a widow or a baker could own a fractional stake in an enterprise they would never visit, would never understand in its specifics, yet could benefit from its success. This democratization of ownership was the VOC's radical gift. That same logic now sustains retirement systems across the developed world. When your pension fund holds a diversified portfolio of stocks, you are participating in an ownership structure that was first imagined in Amsterdam 400 years ago. And what of the volatility, the speculation, the bubbles and panics that seem endemic to stock markets? The Dutch were among the first to experience this too. The wild swings in VOC share prices, the manias and crashes, the fortunes made and lost in days. These were not aberrations but early examples of what would become a recurring pattern. Every modern market crash, from 1729 to 1929 to 2008, carries within it echoes of the madness that seized Amsterdam traders. Are humans simply unable to price assets rationally when they believe prices only go up? Or is this volatility a necessary feature of markets? The friction that allows for price discovery and the transfer of risk? The answer to that question may have been implicit in how the VOC's market functioned, yet we are still wrestling with it today. The modern concept of market regulation itself emerged partly from the chaos of the Amsterdam bourse. When Isaac Lemaire's short-selling campaign created panic and manipulated prices, it prompted authorities to consider whether markets needed rules. Similar conversations happened after every subsequent bubble and crash. What started as ad hoc rules in 17th century Amsterdam became, over centuries, the dense regulatory frameworks of the SEC in America, the FCA in Britain, the financial oversight systems that now govern trading. The question of how much freedom investors should have to do what they wish, and where society should draw lines, was born in those early Dutch days and remains alive today, still contested, still vital. Perhaps most fundamentally, the VOC's innovation was psychological. It demonstrated that investment could become a behavior, a habit, a way of thinking about the future. Once people experienced the possibility of buying something today for less than they expected it to be worth tomorrow, once they felt the thrill and anxiety of that possibility, something shifted in human consciousness. Capital became dynamic rather than static. Money became something that could migrate toward opportunity. Fortunes became available not just to those born into wealth, but to those with knowledge, timing, and luck. This mindset, that the future can be betted upon, that uncertainty can be monetized, that value is inherently a matter of expectation and sentiment, this becomes the operating system of modern capitalism. When you scroll through your financial accounts, when you check your investment portfolio on your phone, when you read about companies disrupting industries or the rise and fall of stock prices in response to quarterly earnings, you are participating in a system whose essential logic was established by Dutch merchants 4 centuries ago, trying to organize a trade route to the East Indies. The evolution has been vast and intricate. Computers have replaced shouting traders. Algorithms have replaced human judgment. The scale has expanded from a few thousand shares to trillions traded daily. Yet the foundational principles remain eerily constant. The market as an information processing mechanism, ownership as divisible and transferable, risk as something that can be quantified, traded, and distributed, the belief that price contains within it a collective judgment about value. What the VOC created was not merely a financial instrument, though it was certainly that. It was a way of thinking about how human cooperation could be organized across space and time, how strangers could pool resources toward a common goal, how the interests of many could be aligned through profit sharing. In that sense, the stock market is not incidental to modern civilization, but central to it. It is how we structure our most ambitious collective endeavors. It is imperfect, vulnerable to manipulation and collapse, capable of generating both immense value and immense cruelty. Yet it persists, because it solves a real problem that human societies keep encountering: how to gather enough capital and enough people to do things that matter. And so we return, as the evening settles over that same harbor where our story began, to find Amsterdam transformed by the weight of centuries yet somehow unchanged. The water that once bore the hope and hunger of ambitious merchants still laps against the stone, still catches the amber light of lanterns hung along the docks, still breathes with the salt-worn patience of the North Sea. The ships are different now, their hulls made of steel rather than oak, their sails replaced by engines that carry no memory of the canvas that once snapped in the monsoon winds. Yet something in the rhythm of commerce, something in the deepest current of how human beings gather capital and share risk and dream together of distant gain, remains threaded through that water like a golden cord that will not fray. We have walked through nearly 4 centuries now, from the moment when competing Dutch traders finally understood that their fractured efforts could not match the coordinated power of monopoly, to the moment when they chose instead to unite, to formalize, to inscribe their partnership in the form of shares that could be bought and sold by anyone with enough coin and enough hope. That choice, made on a cold Amsterdam morning in 1602, set in motion a series of ripples that would eventually touch every ocean, every continent, every corner of human ambition. The VOC, in its immense reach and its terrible hunger, in its innovation and its violence, in its dividends and its debts, became the first experiment in how strangers could pool their fortunes into something larger than themselves, something that outlasted any single person, something that could persist even as its founders turned to dust. What we have traced is not merely the story of a single company, vast as it was, but the birth of a mechanism by which ordinary people, widows in Amsterdam counting out their guilders, bakers wondering if their savings might grow, merchants seeking shelter from the storm of individual risk, could become participants in voyages they would never see, in trades they could scarcely imagine, in profits drawn from spice gardens and monsoon routes on the far side of the world. The Amsterdam Bourse, that revolutionary gathering place where shares changed hands, where prices rose and fell, where Isaac Lemaire attempted his cunning market manipulations and discovered that human greed and fear could be as volatile as any wind, was the stage upon which the modern world first performed itself. And if we pause to think about what followed, about what has flowed down through the generations from that moment of innovation, we find ourselves standing in a curious position. Every stock exchange that exists today, from the grand halls of New York and London to the digital exchanges that flash across screens in Tokyo and Sao Paulo, carries within it the DNA of the VOC, the fundamental architecture of the bourse, the way shares are issued, the way information is distributed to make prices move, the way dividends are paid to those who own fractional pieces of distant enterprises, the way fear and hope play against each other in patterns that repeat like the tides. All of this was first sketched out on those narrow streets of 17th century Amsterdam, was first tested in the minds and ledgers of Dutch merchants who had no idea they were inventing the financial engine of the future. It bears noting, as we drift toward the close of this long evening, that the story of the VOC is not a simple story, nor should we let the mist of hindsight blur its sharper edges. For every widow who saw her modest investment grow, there were enslaved people in Java whose labor was extracted without choice or compensation. For every merchant who celebrated a dividend, there were indigenous communities whose resources were seized and whose autonomy was crushed beneath the weight of a company that operated as though it were a sovereign state rather than a commercial venture. The monopoly that the VOC wielded, purchased with innovation and maintained with violence, was a monopoly nonetheless, and monopolies, by their nature, squeeze out alternatives and concentrate power in ways that shape the world for centuries to come. The stock market that we celebrate as democratizing capital, as allowing ordinary people to share in distant profits, was also an instrument of colonial expansion, a mechanism through which European capital could flow across oceans and bind distant lands to European profit. Yet here is perhaps the strangest paradox of human systems, that something born partly from violence, partly from innovation, partly from sheer accident and desperate circumstance, can also become something that evolves beyond its origins, something that outlives its worst impulses and carries forward its best ones. The VOC, which began as a response to Portuguese monopoly and ended as a burden to itself, bequeathed to the world not only the mechanics of the joint stock company and the trading exchange, but also the possibility, however imperfectly realized, that wealth could be distributed more widely, that capital could be mobilized from many hands rather than concentrated in a few, that the energies and hopes of ordinary people could be channeled toward enterprises they could never have undertaken alone. Consider for a moment what it means that a baker in Amsterdam could own a share of a voyage to the Moluccas, could receive dividends from cloves and nutmeg grown half a world away, could become, in however small a measure, part of an enterprise that spanned continents and centuries. This was a new form of connection between people, a new way of binding human ambitions together across distance and difference. That this system has been misused, has been corrupted, has been used to justify and finance terrible things. This is true and must be remembered. But that it also opened doors to participation and prosperity for many who would otherwise have been locked outside the gates of wealth. This is equally true and equally important to hold in mind as we consider what we have inherited. The lights along the Amsterdam harbour flicker now in the deepening darkness, as they have flickered for 400 years, through revolution and war and the slow turning of epochs. The harbour itself is quieter than it once was, quieter than the nights when merchant ships crowded the wharves and news of profits or losses rippled through the city like wind on water. The era of the VOC is long past, dissolved into history and bureaucracy. and the patient accumulation of archives. Yet the mechanisms it created, the habits of thought it established, the fundamental belief that strangers can safely entrust their fortunes to shared enterprises managed by distant institutions, these have not diminished, but only grown stronger, spreading like roots through every economy on Earth. We might ask ourselves, as we sit with this closing thought, what the merchants of the 17th century would make of our modern world, where billions of shares trade in seconds, where algorithms respond to prices fractionally faster than human eyes can blink, where the average person can own pieces of companies across the globe with a few taps on a glowing screen. Would they recognize their invention? Almost certainly yes. Would they be astonished at its scale? Without doubt. Would they understand the fundamental principle that capital is stronger when pooled, that risk is manageable when distributed, that ordinary people can prosper by placing modest sums into the hands of others who manage distant enterprises? This they would recognize immediately, for this was their great and world-changing insight. What seems almost inevitable to us now, what we take for granted as simply the natural way that markets and capital must operate, was once radically new, almost incomprehensibly strange. That shares could be bought and sold, that their prices could rise and fall, that a person could become wealthy not through trade or manufacture, but simply through owning a portion of something managed by strangers. This was a genuine revolution in how human beings thought about wealth and possibility and the future. And that revolution was born not in theory, but in necessity, not in the halls of philosophers, but in the trading houses and shipyards of Amsterdam, where practical people grappled with practical problems and discovered mechanisms that would reshape the world. The harbour darkens deeper now, and the city beyond it settles into the quietness that comes just before true night, that suspended moment when the day has fully released its grip and sleep is not yet imminent, but hovering just at the edge of consciousness. It is in this space, this threshold between waking and rest, between thought and dream, that we might hold the full complexity of this story, the innovation and the violence, the democratization and the exploitation, the genuine human achievement and the genuine human cost. For that is how history actually moves through the world, not as simple narratives of progress or decline, but as tangled and contradictory unfoldings, where great things and terrible things are often woven so tightly together that it becomes impossible to pull them apart. The VOC changed the world forever, in ways that were not merely financial but social, political, ecological, cultural, changes that still ripple through our lives, that still shape which nation is rich and which is poor, that still echo in the modern corporation and the modern exchange, that still influence how we imagine the future and what we believe is possible. And it did this not through any single great act, but through the patient working out of mechanisms that seemed small at the time, that seemed like practical adjustments to local problems, uniting competing companies, creating shares that could be bought and sold, establishing a gathering place where prices could be discovered through the meeting of many minds and many hopes and many fears. There is something almost restful in recognizing that the foundations of our world were laid not by titans of destiny, but by ordinary people solving problems, experimenting with new forms, finding that what worked for one purpose could be adapted to another. The stock exchange that the VOC created to manage risk and mobilize capital became the model for every exchange that followed, became the template for how entire nations would later organize their economies, became embedded so deeply in our understanding of how wealth works that we can scarcely imagine an alternative. And yet at some point in history, someone first had to imagine it, had to propose it, had to convince others to try it, had to accept the risk that it might fail. As the evening deepens and the harbour settles into the gentle lapping of water against stone, as the lights along the docks fade into the thickening darkness, we might allow ourselves to rest in this understanding that the world is not fixed, that systems change, that human ingenuity can create forms and structures that persist and evolve and eventually reshape everything. The VOC is gone now, dissolved and forgotten except by historians and curious minds like yours. But what it created endures, transformed and invisible, woven so deeply into the fabric of how we live that we no longer notice it is there. And that perhaps is the ultimate legacy of any great institution. Not that it persists forever, but that what it created becomes so much a part of the world that we forget it was ever new. Let that thought settle gently, like the night itself settling over the old harbour of Amsterdam, where 400 years ago, a few ambitious merchants decided to pool their resources and change the world forever. The harbour is at rest now, as perhaps you are beginning to be, as the long story of capital and risk and human connection gradually releases its hold and allows the mind to